So my name is Fabien Roch. I'm a scientific director for the CEEM, the Chair on European Electricity Market. On behalf of the food team, I see Jan just arriving. I'm very happy to welcome you to this conference on a new electricity market model. Is decoupling the right approach? So you know that decoupling has become the buzzword of policy discussions on electricity markets, but there is a lot of confusion about what decoupling means. And we've put together that conference with the idea that academics and experts could hopefully start going into the meat and provide some light on these issues. So as always, we have a mix of, I would say, international speakers. Let me walk you through the program. So we'll have two keynote speeches, one from Christophe Janscreux, who is head of the electricity department at Acer, and another keynote introduction from Dominique Jam, who is the Director General of the French regulator CRE. We'll then have a first session that will focus very much on short-term price signals and long-term price signals for investments. So the issue of decoupling between short-term and long-term, if I may. And we'll have 5 speakers. I'll let them be introduced by Jan in due course. We'll then have a short coffee break. In session 2, we will focus on the issue of wholesale and retail decoupling, which is another way to cut the pie on decoupling. Boris Solier from the CEEM will moderate this session and will introduce the 3 speakers. And finally, we'll have a concluding roundtable discussion with the CEEM sponsors, with representatives from EDF, EPEX, RTE, and Total Energy. So that's the plan. And without further ado, I think I'm going to hand over to Christophe to get us started.
Thank you, Fabien. Thank you. So good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity to debate this important topic with all of you. Maybe there is no need to further explain the context, but just to remind that we are in a very exceptional situation, a mismatch between energy supply and demand caused by a series of unfortunate events and giving rise to a big affordability issue as the energy prices have reached unprecedented levels. Some, in this exceptional situation, some would like to blame the market design, others the marginal pricing methodology, some the European Commission, Acer, NRAs, and other more simply member states who, after all, are responsible, according to the subsidiarity principle, they are responsible for the security of supply. It might not be so wise to enter into this blaming game and focus our energy to address the problem. And in that respect, I have 3 messages to deliver. My first message is that I heard recently a lot of criticism about the market design. It is imperfect, it is incomplete, progress is slow, mainly due to a complex governance framework with a multiplicity of sometimes incompatible private and national interests. But let's keep in mind that if we manage to pass the next winter, if we are able to meet all together today in this conference room with the heating and the lighting, it's in particular it's thanks to the market design we have today, and more specifically, thanks to all the effort that we have put over the last 10 years to integrate markets, to facilitate and improve cross-border trade in Europe, efforts which are eventually paying off today. The level of interdependence of the European energy system is unprecedented in the world. Over the last 10 years, we managed to achieve a lot of progress that we can be proud of, and which are the result of a huge collective effort from TSOs, NEMOs, NRAs, the European Commission, and ACER. This level of market integration is a big strength, maybe our biggest strength in this difficult period. Something that we definitely need to preserve and further develop and strengthen in the coming months and years. This is a top priority. As a regulator, I will say that this market integration is maybe the best contribution we can bring to the security of supply in Europe. I really wish our policymakers remember this in the coming weeks or months when deciding a possible market design reform. My second message, and maybe this is a kind of mea culpa, the main lesson that we have learned from this crisis, in my view, is that this big risk aversion for extreme price volatility, in particular for episodes of sustained extreme high prices. This is something that we all have maybe underestimated and that we need to fix as soon as possible. Hence, here comes the idea of the decoupling idea. I know that there are different interpretations of this decoupling approach. My understanding of this decoupling is it's a long-term insurance tool to protect market participants from extreme price volatility. So on one hand, we protect investors against sustained extreme low prices, and on the other hand, we want to protect end consumers from sustained extreme high prices. I don't see the possible deployment of this insurance scheme as a market design reform per se, even less a deep and comprehensive market design reform. Such insurance mechanisms already exist. We have CFDs, we have CRM, we have support scheme for renewable, we have regulated tariff in some member states. All these insurance schemes may need to be fine-tuned and improved, but they can perfectly complement the existing market design. Of course, we need time to properly design this insurance mechanism. It's especially important that market participants keep on being exposed to a minimum level of price volatility and keep on receiving the right incentives. We also need time to ensure a minimum of coordination, both on the design and the implementation of these tools, if possible at EU level, in order to avoid market fragmentation and market distortion. I'm sure you all have many good ideas, and I'm quite confident that with a bit of time and patience, we will be able to find and to design these tools. But we need to be conscious of the fact that even if we manage to design and implement these tools quickly, their implementation will not pay off before some time. So what do we do in the meantime? How do we appease our policymakers who are under strong pressure to address the problem now? And here comes now the third and final message. Let's stay focused and not fool ourselves. As explained before, the main problem we are facing with is a security of supply issue. Even the best and well-thought-through market design reform cannot address such a problem. Instead, let's try to be pragmatic and put our priority at least on 4 issues. The first one is to mobilize, as soon as possible, all possible additional resources, be it on supply or demand. So to mobilize all possible additional resources in the system, even if this possibly means putting aside for a moment the CO2 emission indicators. Then the second priority should be to maintain the solidarity principle and in particular access to cross-border trade. As explained before, this is maybe the best contribution we can bring to security of supply in the present difficult circumstances. The third priority is to implement all the temporary emergency measures that have been recently adopted by the European Commission. This revenue cap, this infra-marginal revenue cap, and the redistribution schemes. These temporary emergency measures are most likely here to stay, at least until we manage to get out of the curve. And maybe, and this is the last point, another priority, maybe for the medium term, maybe we need to foster the development of all kinds of flexible resources in Europe. In a couple of weeks, Acer will submit its framework guidelines on demand response, which will include some high-level principles to facilitate the development of all kinds of flexible resources in Europe. Then these framework guidelines will give rise to the adoption of new set of updated rules in a couple of years, which then still have to be implemented. So we are talking about a 5 years period here. But again, let's not fool ourselves. We don't have the luxury to wait that long. If we want to successfully achieve the energy transition, we need to complement these future rules with a voluntary, ambitious, bottom-up approach where all the goodwill in Europe is mobilized to develop pilot test projects to identify best practices and promote the most promising ones. Acer is happy to contribute to this bottom-up approach, and I personally believe that beyond all the measures and ideas brought forward so far to fix the problem we are facing with, this is, in my view, the decisive one. Voilà, before the serious discussion actually starts, these were the 3 messages I wanted to share with you. And I'm looking forward to the debate.
Thank you, Christophe. Dominique, over to you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this very, very well-timed and pertinent workshop. You will, in this introduction, hear some the same, I would say, accent, because this is the accent from Toulouse in France. The English spoken with the Toulouse accent, because we are of the same origin with Christophe, and we are, Creux and Acer are working a lot together and in very good understanding. Let me start with some advertising, because Creux will organize a workshop next 15th of December, next week afternoon, regarding more or less the same issues of market design for electricity and all the ideas for a new market design, because obviously it's hot topics. So everybody of you is welcome to this workshop with a very, very good economist, very, very good panels. Not better than today, because it's impossible, but I would say. So the idea of decoupling is very, very interesting, and I think the 2 kind of decoupling is kind of a good idea to try to make things clearer. There is a kind of a third one, which is which we heard a lot, which is decoupling the price of electricity from the price of gas, which is kind of around the same issue, but I think it's worth mentioning. So the question is, I would like to address is, I would like to ask questions in my introduction. And so the first one is, what is the goal, the end goal that we are pursuing with this market reform? I think we should focus on that, because if the goal is not clear, then the end show will not be good. So trying to go around this question, I would like to stress, even as Christophe just did it a few minutes ago, that what our markets, our market now, market design, actual market design now is delivering, has delivered, we can say. First of all, short-term price signals. I think they are absolutely necessary in any kind of reform that we would like to adopt. Then they are needed for efficient dispatch in every member state, but at the European level. I think that is working perfectly fine. They are needed for demand response. They are needed for that. The signals were not there in the past, so we have not seen a lot of demand response, but we have started seeing them, and we will see them more and more with the prices, especially in France in the next quarter, I would say. They are necessary for the optimal use of stored energy, whether this is gas, or hydro, or even, in some cases, nuclear and other ones. So broadly speaking, they are necessary for every kind of short-term flexibility. And we will need a lot of short-term flexibility in our electricity system in the next years and the next decades, because everybody knows that we are going to have a lot more wind and solar in our electricity system. So it would be, from my point of view, crazy to lose that. And I expect we can get today, and also at Creux workshop and in the general discussion, kind of consensus by the academic sector regarding the importance of keeping that short-term price signals. Then there are the future markets. Obviously, they are very, very important because that future market, they are transmitted to end user and to consumers. And we have seen that they have rocketed. And so that's the political issue is there. So, but let's not forget that they also are very useful at the moment. For instance, we have full gas storage in Europe now, and it is due to the signal, and Europe has been able to get all the LNG available in the world due to this signal, this European signal. For instance, if you see the next electricity quarter in France, which is very, very tight, as everybody knows, January, February. RT just announced a few days ago that they expect to have 3 to 4 gigawatt less than normal as consumption due to those high prices. We don't know if it is industrial production lost or if it is effort of efficiency by industrial actors, maybe both of them. But anyway, those 3 to 4 gigawatt will be very, very useful next January and February, given the present situation. So those markets are delivering a lot of things. Keeping that in mind, I would formulate the question or formulate the goal this way. We would like to keep electricity bills for consumers in line with production costs of the mix, especially in time of crisis. So not rocketing as we have seen, while preserving the huge efficiency of spot and future markets. I think that's the way I would formulate the question. I don't know if it's possible this while, but that's the way I would formulate the question. And a second question, and then I'll stop there. We read a lot of around the ideas of central buyer, generalized CFD, etc., etc. So very, very fine ideas. The question is, are we able to design such innovative systems compatible with markets and with short-term and future markets? This would be the way I would formulate the question. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much, Dominique. I'd like to open the floor just to 1 or 2 quick questions before passing on to Jan for the first session. Any reaction from the audience? Well, Jan, I'll hand over to you then.
Yeah, then let's go with the session.
Yeah, we have a tight program for this afternoon, so I suggest we go ahead.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Fabien. Yes, grabbing the micro because we have a session of 1 hour and 10 minutes for 5 speakers, of whom we know that they have a lot to say and a lot of important things to say. So we would like to give them the maximum of time. Let me very briefly comment just on the title of this session: decoupling of short-term price signals and long-term signals for investment. In the spirit of the introductory note, keynote speakers, it's probably as much about complementing short-term price signals and long-term signals. It doesn't need to be a contradiction, that they sort of develop independently, but that they sort of work together towards the same goal. As I mentioned, we have 5 very good speakers. We have Natalia Fabra, who's professor at the University Carlos III, I imagine in Spanish, 3, and head of the Energy Economics Lab. We have Bert Willems from Tilburg University, and a well-known researcher in the field. We have Malcolm Kay and David Robinson, probably just one of them, from the Oxford Institute of Energy Studies. We have Fabien, whom you all know, of course. And then we have Dominique Finot and Etienne Becker. Dominique, of course, has worked for many years here with us at the CEEM and Dauphine. And Etienne Becker is at France Stratégie. In the interest of time, I would like to really ask all the 5 speakers to stick to 10 minutes, 12 minutes, big maximum, to leave a little bit of time for some exchange with the audience, which is also very knowledgeable. I recognize many people. With that, I would like to hand over right away to Natalia. Natalia, could you please tell us about the new electricity market architecture?
Okay, thank you very much, Jan. Thank you for the invitation. I cannot see you, but I hope you can see me.
We can, yes, very well.
Okay, let me try and share, because I'm not sure. Can you see my slides?
Not yet, but perhaps soon.
Sharing is pause. I don't know. Maybe, Fabian, is it easier? It says that sharing is pause. Maybe it's easier if you show my slides inside, so that I don't make you wait longer.
We're trying. We're working on that right now.
So, in the interest of time, I'll start speaking. Thank you very much for this invitation, and I'm really sorry that I cannot be there with you in Paris.
Okay, just to let you know, we can see your slides now here from the local source. So we'll try to sort of follow up with what you say and try to sort of click them through. Okay, over to you.
Thank you very much. If you can please move one ahead. This is just also publicity. All I'm gonna say is described more thoroughly in this recent working paper that I just released through the CEPR. Next slide, please. Excellent. So I'll start addressing what I think is also a very important question. So Dominique mentioned that if we are to reform electricity markets, we first need to understand what the main objectives are. So very briefly, I think this is not very different to what economists would typically put forward, which is we want to achieve efficiency and we want to achieve equity. When it comes to electricity, electricity is about production in the short run, and it is about investment in the long run. So if we are to achieve efficient outcomes, we have to make sure that in the short run, there's productive efficiency, there's consumption efficiency. For that matter, we have to make sure that we have the right instruments so that the least cost production units are dispatched at all times. And these instruments, markets, provide the short-run price signal that can guide the demand response decisions, the storage decisions, as well as the consumption decisions. But at the same time, because electricity is also about investment, we have to put in place mechanisms that allow to achieve efficiency in the long run, meaning that investments take place at the right scale, with the right technology, and the right locations, and something which I believe is very important. Here there is something very important that we need to allocate efficiently, and that is risk. So the mechanisms that we put in place should also be efficient in that sense. And of course, surplus has to be shared efficiently and in an equitable manner between consumers and producers, also because electricity is an input, and therefore we have to make sure that this input is reflecting cost in order to make sure that there are no efficiency distortions in markets downstream, including the necessity to electrify our economies as the main vehicle for electrification. So if we really want to push electricity forward, it's very important that we make sure that the prices we are paying for electricity do not exceed the cost. Next slide, please. So in achieving these objectives, there's a certain key high-level economic principles that I would like to highlight that inspire the proposals that I'm going to share with you that are very much in line with proposals that some of you in this room have already shared. The first one is that economists we know for many years now, I would even say centuries, that non-linear pricing is a very powerful tool that allows us to achieve two important objectives, and let me use here the term of the day, which is decouple. We can decouple the short-run price signal from the price level or from the inframarginal rents, and for that matter, non-linear pricing can be very useful, and this can be applied both when determining how to pay to generation as well as how to make consumers pay for their consumption. The second principle that some have already alluded to before is the fact that risks are costly, so the instruments that we have to put in place must be allocating this risk efficiently in order to achieve efficient outcomes. And related to this, we know that there might be a trade-off between exposing technologies to short-run prices that can be, as was already mentioned before, highly volatile and highly difficult to predict, and the need to de-risk the investment, which tend to be very capital intensive. And the benefits of exposing technologies to the short-run price signal very much varies across technologies, given their different abilities to respond to this price signal, and therefore this trade-off must be assessed technology by technology, meaning the contracts that we design for the various technologies need not be the same no matter what technology we are dealing with. The fourth principle, which I developed in a recent economic journal paper, is the fact that whereas technology neutrality can be a very valuable principle, it need not be the default. The benefits of technology neutrality have to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. In a nutshell, there's typically a trade-off between rent destruction and efficiency, which, depending on the type of technologies that we're dealing with, in some cases might favor some correction on technology neutrality as the general principle that has been guiding many of the market design elements that we have had so far. And last but not least, I think that competition is an extremely powerful tool, but for this to be the case, the market has to be competitive. And if the market is not competitive and it's difficult to make it competitive, then we should not discard regulation as also a very powerful tool to come up with efficient outcomes. Building on these very broad and economic principles, if I may see the next slide, please. Let me go on and explain what I think would be a market architecture that would manage to address the goals that I just enumerated before in an efficient and equitable manner. I fully share the view that Dominic just shared, that we cannot do without efficient and liquid and transparent short-term energy markets. It's clear that demand and supply conditions change a high frequency, so we have to make sure that every moment of time, if we are to achieve productive efficiency, we are serving demand with the most efficient technologies, and therefore we need short-term markets. I think there's a scope to improve the performance of these markets as compared to the recent performance of these markets. I like the original market design in the UK, in which participation in these markets was compulsory, which clearly doesn't prevent players from entering into financial contracts with third parties. Compulsory participation in this market would certainly increase the liquidity and transparency in this market and would make the role of the system operator easier because it would be more straightforward to truly understand which units are available and not. However, what I think we are missing, as has already been mentioned before, is markets for long-term contracts. I think it's there's broad agreement regarding the fact that the futures market are missing, but I think there's a lack of understanding that futures markets are not going to rise spontaneously. There was no reason why they couldn't arise before, and if they have not, it's probably because there's a market failure that we are not addressing properly. So I think that the way out of this market failure is that the system or the regulator or you name it, a counterparty that is representing all consumers creates these markets for long-term contracts. So the proposal is to have the regulator acting an important role in deciding, which by the way, they already do through the national energy and climate plans, deciding on the scale of the investments that are needed and organizing options for these long-term contracts. These long-term contracts should be tailored to the characteristics of the different needs that we might have. So the general idea is that these contracts are going to be somehow settled against the short-term market. So in that sense, as Jan said, these long-term markets are complementing, or the short-term markets are complementing, or in any case, the two of them, not only they are compatible, but they're reinforcing the benefits of each other, because these long-term markets also favor a better performance of the short-term market. So there's a coexistence between short-term and long-term markets that are being organized by the regulator or the system as a counterparty, offering contracts whose characteristics are well suited for the characteristics of the various technologies. So for instance, we can think generically as the auctioning of contracts for differences, with more or less price exposure depending on the characteristics of the different investments. So for instance, if we're dealing with intermittent renewables, contract for differences, so that the contracts are settled against the average price of the technology over a certain period of time, for instance, a month, as for instance, what they do in Germany would be suitable in order to promote the de-risking of the investments while retaining a small fraction of this price exposure that would lead to, for instance, optimal investments regarding the location of the assets and so on and so forth. But no more than that, given that intermittent renewables, essentially the production is exogenously given, so the benefits of exposing these technologies to the short-run price signal is not that high. This is clearly in contrast to, for instance, what happens with hydropower plants, for which we want to preserve their full price exposure so that they have the right incentives to produce at peak times, but we can perfectly do so in a compatible manner with the fact that we want to somehow adjust the average price that they receive. And how can we do that? We can do this with what I propose and I label as flexibility contracts, which essentially is nothing but a contract for differences. But instead of settling this contract against the market price, we could, for instance, settle it against the average annual market price, so that the hydro producer would be the residual claimant on any difference between the market price and the average market price, therefore fully preserving the price exposure. I don't want to go into full detail, also to give the floor to my colleagues. This is just a broad picture of how I think that we could absolutely make the short run, the long run, on the markets for long run contracts fully compatible with each other, and providing this additional tool that we need in order to make these markets more efficient. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalia. Very interesting indeed. And as you sort of said at the end, this is almost a research program. to work this out, to justify it. I think the overall indication is exactly the direction we need to go, but we now need to sort of justify it, perhaps also in conceptual terms, more in detail in order to convince also all our colleagues and policymakers that this is the way to go. Thank you very much indeed. And then we will move over to Bert Willems from Tilburg University. And he will indeed go into auction design. So this is part of this, research program on bidding and investment in wholesale electricity markets, pay as bid versus uniform price auctions. Bert, over to you, and please be mindful of the very strict timing constraint.
Okay, thanks. So I will continue where Natalia left. So she has discussed the clear price, pay as clear in her presentation. So what I'm going to do is to look at pay as bid and uniform price auctions, and we're going to compare them and see what do we know from the literature. So this is a joint work with Yu-Ting Yu, who is a PhD student from Tilburg University. So what's the whole idea between uniform price auction and pay as bid auctions? So on the left side of the figure we have uniform price auction. That's the way how the markets are working. So we have a bid stack. So we have all the bids from all the producers. We have demand side. We see where the market clears, and that's sort of micro 101. And the market clearing price, that's the price that all the producers get paid. So now there's discussion among policymakers that maybe we should change this market design and we should go to the pay as bid auction. And this is on the right side of the figure. So we still have the bids of the producers. We have demand. We have market clearing, but instead of paying everybody the clearing price, we're going to pay everybody their bid into the market. And the idea is that if you look on the left and on the right side, consumer surplus on the right side is larger. So it seems that this would be a good idea to introduce because consumers are going to gain. And the other benefit might be that if, let's say, the coal or gas prices are going to increase, that the consumer bill is not going to depend so much on those marginal power plants, but on sort of the average bids into the market, so that we're sort of decoupling the payments for consumers. But this question isn't that easy to solve. So there are two problems. So the first is that consumers are going to adjust their bids. So you cannot just assume that if you change the market rules that all the market participants are going to bid in the same way as they would do with the uniform price auction. And there's a second change, and that's that investment might change. If the profitability of firms is going to change because they receive a lower price, they're going to invest less. So we might end up with a different generation mix, and this might also be bad for consumers. So this means that this naive picture where we say, yeah, of course we have to go for pay as bid auction, that this is not true once we start taking into account bidding behavior, investment behavior, and this is not the case. So from economic theory, we have something that's called the revenue equivalence theorem, and that says that if you have a single good auction, that it doesn't matter whether you use first price auction or second price auction, and that's the same discussion that we have here, whether we compare uniform price auction and a pay as bid auction. That's basically a multi-unit extension from this single good auction. So what we need is that we need a model where we're going to look at this multiple goods. And that's what we do in our paper. So you can send me an email if you want to know a little bit more about this. But what we're doing is we're constructing a monopolistic competition model where you have atomistic firms. So it's a model with perfect competition. And all those firms have a trade-off. They can set a margin in the market, so they can set the price above their marginal cost. But they face the risk if they set the price too high that they might not be in the market and they might not produce. So we have free entry. So this means that all the firms are going to make zero profit in the long run, so they can choose what kind of technology they're going to invest. And then we see what kind of generation mix we get. And then we have cost heterogeneity. So we have a continuum of generation technologies from base load to peak load generation, and we have uncertain elastic demand. And generators are going to bid a long-lived bid, so they submit once a bid, which is going to be valid for the rest of the life of the power plant. So what do we find from this paper? So there's a lot of mathematics, but the end result is quite straightforward. So on the uniform price auction, the players are going to bid their marginal cost. But with the pay-as-bid auction, they're going to bid their levelized cost. So we have free entry, so they make zero profit in the long run, so they have to bid their marginal cost, plus they have to take into account the fixed cost divided by the capacity factor. So the capacity factor is how often they are producing, so you analyze your investment cost, and then you say I'm producing 50% of the time, and I need to recoup this by setting a price. So what does this mean? That means that on the pay-as-bid auction, your consumer surplus is going to be lower, because prices are distorted away from the first best. And we also see that the investment patterns are different, so you get less baseload capacity, but the total capacity in the market stays the same. So we have a distortion in the generation mix, and we have a lower consumer surplus. So we do some robustness results. If you introduce inelastic demand or you introduce short-lived bids, then basically pay-as-bid auction and uniform price auction, they become the same. So our result is still that pay-as-bid auctions are worse. So what does this mean for policy? So outside of this model, this uniform price auction, they might have other benefits. So uniform price auction means that we have a uniform price, a liquid reference price for financial contracts, also a reference price for flexibility, which was already mentioned before. It's also easier for firms to bid in a uniform price auction because they only need to know their own costs, and that's something they know, while in a pay-as-bid auction they need to guess what the bid or the equilibrium price is going to be, and this means that large firms, they do not have information advantage about market conditions, so a uniform price auctions has some additional benefits. So we can also look at empirical evidence on spot market outcomes, and we can see what does now matter for the market outcome. There's not that much empirical literature, but what we know is that market fundamentals, let's say what's the generation technology mix, what's demand elasticity, what are the gas prices, those kind of things, that matters for market outcomes. What we also know is that market structure matters, so that's the number of firms that are active in the market, but also the vertical market structure, and that's the amount of long-term contracts that we have in the market. So if you have more long-term contracts, markets become more competitive. What we see in those results, empirical results, is that market design, if you try to correct for market design, either by even in Greens, they look at a situation in the UK. There have been several reforms in the UK. If you include this as a dummy in your regressions, this dummy doesn't have any effect. Borenstein and colleagues, they look at the California market, they compare it with PGM in New England, and they see if you take all those first elements into account, market fundamentals and market structure, then those three markets, they are performing in the same way. So it's not that the Californian market was that badly designed, but correcting for those other things, you already could see a lot. So what's the conclusion? So this discussion of uniform price auction is not new. So every time when there is a market where there's a crisis, this discussion pops up again, and economists need to re-educate politicians and journalists because for them it's the first time they learn about those things. And instead of a spot market design, we should discuss long-term contracts because that's really, truly how we are going to decouple energy bills for consumers. That's what we care about. So if consumers are hedged, if they have a long-term contract, their bill does not depend on the spot price. And once we introduce those long-term contracts, the design of the spot market is going to matter less because large fraction of your bill is hedged. So whether you have a uniform price auction or a pay-as-bid auction, on the margin this is going to be small, and those long-term contracts are also going to have some benefits for reducing market power in the spot market. I mean, I don't know how much time I have left, probably nothing. Yes?
You have time for one concluding sentence.
We can discuss more, so I will also make some publicity for something that we're organizing on the 16th of December. So we have some colleagues, we have some ideas about future markets as well, more than what I said today.
Great, thank you very much indeed. And I'm very encouraged by your paper that Walras and marginalist theory still holds, even under a number of assumptions. And I completely agree with you. We need to educate politicians on basic microeconomics. That is a very important part of our task. We will move on straight away. Timing is really exceptionally tight today. To the paper by Malcolm Kay. It's good to see Malcolm again here, whom I met more than 20 years ago. Much more than, well, I don't know. And David Robinson on energy market design and the impact of decarbonization, the two-market approach. Martin.
Okay, thank you, Jan. I'm going to disappoint you by saying you're going to have two speakers for the price of one.
Okay.
But the reason is that I'm going to start by saying a bit about the UK situation, partly because you may be less familiar with it, partly because, in my view, and you probably disagree, the debate in the UK is further advanced than it is here. The reason for that is, to a large extent, in this graph you see here, the heavy lifting in decarbonisation in the UK has been taken entirely by electricity supply. That's the green line at the top of this chart. And it's been taken essentially by the introduction and increasing penetration of renewables. Now, changing technology doesn't just change carbon emissions, it changes the whole operation of the system. We've seen in earlier graphs some similar schematics to this, showing how SRMC, short-run marginal cost pricing, is supposed to work. It's always been a bit more complicated than this, but there's been two basic intuitions underlying it. The first is that different generating sources have different short-run marginal costs. That's not really going to be the situation in future for a large part of the market. The second is that different generation sources are going to be dispatchable. That's not going to be the situation in future for large parts of the market. That is what the UK government is consulting about now, and that is why it is seriously considering various forms of decoupled markets. These are at the top are two quotes about the from the UK's paper, the consultation paper. The first one says that by 2035, excess generation, that's mainly renewables, will represent about 50% of the hours, that's the hours in the year, and rising above 60% by 2050. We're in a completely different situation from just now. Up until now in the UK, for 99% of the time rather, the marginal plant has always been a fossil plant or imports. In future, for most of the time, the marginal plant is going to be a renewable source, which simply does not fit in to the short-run marginal cost schema. Also, one consequence is that in periods of excess generation, the wholesale price will be set by renewables and will therefore result in very low prices. Just going briefly back to the previous slide, what it means is that in the past you had a stack of generators like this. In future, that stack on the generation side will look nothing like that, but you will have a stack with that shape on the demand side representing different values of lost load. Which is essentially the valuation consumers put on their electricity supply. The challenge will be, therefore, sorry, I'm going the wrong way, to develop, as the British government consultation paper says, a smart, flexible energy system which can cope with that. I should stress, although the UK consultation is partly on the basis of high marginal prices and the political problems of declining renewables costs not getting through to consumers, the thinking underlying the paper that David and I wrote is a lot longer ago than that and is based on the forthcoming problems in electricity prices and electricity markets. In our view, electricity markets based on short-run marginal cost are simply broken. Firstly, because of the price cannibalization I've mentioned, the fact that when renewables are at the margin most of the time, prices will be very low. The consequence of that is that there will not be incentives for investment coming from the market. And therefore, the government's going to have to underpin all investment, which I personally, is a situation I personally would like to avoid. There will be no useful signals for operation, because renewables receive priority dispatch and because they can't be dispatched if they're not available. So the price is irrelevant to them at that time. There are no useful signals for consumers because they don't directly face the lower cost of renewables, which, as I said, is one of the motivations under the rethinking that's taking place just now. And there is no exit strategy from this situation. As renewables more and more frequently get to the margin, prices will get lower and lower for more and more of the time. So governments will have to subsidize whatever electricity generating sources there are more and more. So you will have no way out of the system. And indeed, the change could happen very suddenly, and that's a big risk. Our approach to get around these problems is what we've called the two-market approach. What it does is separate two markets, both at consumer and producer end, and it's important in our view that it's at both ends. So you have as available generators, which are basically intermittent generators, and you have on-demand generators, which are flexible generators. It's essentially a giant flexibility market, which operates much as at present. The other market operates on the basis of long-run marginal cost, which in the UK, there's a good proxy for it in the contract for difference prices. So it's a long-run price. So it's distinguishing to that extent the long run from the short run. The difference being that both these markets then flow through to the consumers. We've shown them on this chart, which is a bit oversimplified, as flowing through the system operator. But in fact, the generators would deal with suppliers who in turn would supply to consumers in two separate markets. So they would get the renewables price, as it were, when renewables were operating, and the fossil fuel price when fossil fuel was operating. The incentives on them, therefore, to adjust their demand and adjust their use of electricity would be very considerable. And in the interest of time, I'll pass over to David now to spell out some of these advantages.
How many minutes? Sorry. How many minutes do I have left? 4. Okay. Well, we're going to focus on two advantages of this approach. One is the fact that we don't decouple, we actually couple or integrate wholesale and retail, that is upstream and downstream. The idea being that the already exist two markets upstream. We've got, for instance, CFDs, we've got PPAs, we've got various other ways in which upstream we've got as available markets with fixed prices that reflect the life cycle costs of energy, but we don't see those downstream. And so the idea is that customers see that signal separately from the signal for buying what we call on-demand or firm energy, and we think it's important that they see both. The as available energy will be generally a lot less expensive but intermittent. That will create incentives for consumers to develop flexibility, to invest in storage. It also will promote electrification, which itself will create opportunities for greater flexibility through, for instance, for electric vehicles and heat pumps. That creates new markets for, I should say, new business models to provide this type of as available energy to renewable, that is to customers who want to be flexible. We can give examples of that. And to a new supply chain for linking consumers to the availability of these different types of energies. The second advantage, the last one I wanted to mention is simply that the way this works is that it actually allows a separation in terms of, it allows different levels of security to reflect consumer preferences. Those consumers who prefer to have firm energy all the time and not have any intermittency will pay more. They will pay the energy cost in the on-demand market. Those consumers who are willing to accept the intermittency and to manage it will essentially be demanding less from the system. So system security is no longer a uniform service. It's something which you pay for depending on what you need. And I think with that, I'm probably going to have to stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Also for the really taut timing. I wonder to which extent your ideas are how shall I say, convergent with those being presented by Natalia in particular. There might be some tweaks in terms of the precise institutional setup, but I think the underlying philosophy is quite similar. With that, we will move on to another building block of this new combination of short-term price signals and long-term price signals. Fabien Roch will tell us about barriers to long-term contracts and possible approaches to support the development, given that long-term signals are clearly an important part of the market design of the future. Fabien.
Thank you, Jan. So I wanted to discuss about forward markets and PPAs, but I could not resist saying a bit more about hybrid markets. And you will see that I think we are very much aligned both with Natalia David Malcolm on some of the principles, and I think where we potentially diverge is on the precise implementation. And I'll try to shed light on the different variants of hybrid models we can have. So I'll skip the intro, and I'll remind you that this is not new. The question of how we can complement existing short-term markets with hedging instruments has been discussed in the literature for about 10 years. With my friend Dominique Finon, we have looked at it already some time ago, and we started to document that as the focus has been essentially on short-term efficiency. You see here the typical chain of wholesale energy markets, so they're ahead. Then in Europe, we have focused on intraday and balancing, which is very much being integrated at the moment, and retail markets. This is all good, and I agree that this is very precious. We should not destroy it. We should be very careful. But what is missing is essentially what can help to reconcile this with policymakers' targets and objectives. So you start reading that from the left, you see that we have targets to deploy some specific technologies for decarbonization. We have targets for security of supply. And these can be consistent or not with what the market would reveal. Consumers may reveal a preference for clean energy, but it certainly is different from what policymakers will want. Similarly, customers may be revealing a value for security of supply for those who can with smart meters, but to a large extent this is different from the risk aversion, the extreme risk aversion we have seen from policymakers. So what do we need? Well, we need a framework to understand how to bring the two together, and we are clearly going to operate in a second best world. This is something I've discussed for a long time with my friend Thomas. So we should not underestimate the fact that by being in the second best world, we are also losing on efficiency. And the key is going to be to compromise, as Natalia puts it, to understand the trade-offs, to lose the minimum amount of efficiency, and to gain on the other side on the coordination. So first, if we are all in agreement that we need some kind of long-term contracts, we need a basis to define the need for these long-term contracts. So we need a framework to understand how much we are going to need to contract forward. I'm going to come to that, but that's number one. Then we need our investment framework with long-term contracts, and then we need to decide how to pass through the costs of these long-term contracts and the risk associated with these to consumers. So these are number 1, 2, and 3, what I would add to the existing markets we have. And I've tried to revisit that chart. That chart is actually 8 years old, so sometimes it's good to revisit old publications, where essentially we said we need holistic planning of system needs. We need competition for the market with tendering of long-term contracts. We then need competition in the market, which is based on existing internal market. And then we need a framework for consumer protection and engagement, which is essentially how do you pass through the cost. But what I've tried to do in revisiting that old chart, which is several years old, is to highlight the key questions along the way. So first question, if we all agree we are going to need to contract forward, who defines the need? Is it the state? Or is that consumers? Or is it non-defined in the market? I'd say on many of these needs today, we've left it to the market. So EOM stands for Energy Only Market, or PPAs. But you can also have an improvement of the current situation where you actually build in the market a mechanism to reveal individual preferences. For security of supply, an example of that is a model of capacity subscriptions, where you explicitly ask consumers to express their willingness to pay for security of supply. It's just to show that it doesn't have to be the state automatically. Second question. Once you have decided you want to tender for long-term contracts, how do you do that? Again, do you do it centrally? So do you have a central counterparty, the state? Or do you have a decentralized approach via supplier obligation? To make it concrete, let's look at capacity mechanism. In France, we have a decentralized obligation on suppliers who have to contract bilaterally. In the UK, to talk about the UK, we have a centralized auction for capacity. These have different properties in terms of incentives. It doesn't have, again, to be fully centralized. Third layer, once you have obviously contracted forward, as a principle, you need to define the product. And I think this was Dominic's point in the introduction. You need to be very careful when you define the product that this will not cannibalize your existing forward markets, which are very precious for energy. And a question you have is, are you going to do it technology neutral or not? Natalia mentioned that there is a trade-off there. So you can have separate products. So for instance, a capacity remuneration mechanism, separate CFDs for renewables, or you can try to have it all in one tool, a multi-attribute long-term contracting framework. And this is what we see, for instance, in PJM New England, where they are converting the old capacity mechanism to contract also for clean capacity. And final stage, you obviously have to decide how you pass through the costs. The tariff will have to be designed taking into account the cost of these long-term contracts. But there is an important question here. Do all consumers pay the same? It will depend, because if you decide that you are going to hedge for some consumers specifically and let the other ones decide themselves, in other words, if some of your consumers are going to be on the right-hand side, the states decide for them. And if for some other consumers they are going to be on the left-hand side, they decide themselves, then the cost pass-through is naturally going to be different as well. So this is a kind of architecture that we will need to research collectively in the next few years to provide the answers. So I know I don't have much time and I want to show a good example, so I'll skip a few slides. I have some slides on forward trading, and it's very interesting that ESER, your team, Christophe, is looking at how we can facilitate liquidity in forward markets. And I agree with a lot of the solutions you put forward, but I'd like to highlight one thing that in my view is missing and should really be the focus of our discussion, which is the bottom part of that chart. Fundamentally, why is that suppliers today don't want to engage into long-term contracts? It's because of retail competition. If they lose consumers, then naturally they will not be able to cover their cost if they are committed long-term. So we have a trade-off here and a deep issue. In other industry, if you look at mobile phones, for instance, you can have termination fees if consumers leave, for instance. There is an alternative, which is the principle of the obligation going with the consumer. So I switch supplier, I go with my contract for hedging, which has a cost. But I really think we need to tackle these issues if we are to provide some more demand for long-term contracting. PPAs, I'm doing quite a bit of research on PPAs at the moment. You see that in some countries, look at the top, Spain, Sweden, Norway, we actually have a very active market for long-term contracts. So why is that? Well, there are a number of constraints in other markets, but also there are some specificities which make it possible in these countries and not possible in others. I'm going to give you some concrete examples on how we can support PPAs. So this is a spectrum. Let's start from the left. The least interventionist approach is obviously to remove some of the barriers we see in some countries. Then you can have public guarantees for some of the SMEs, the small enterprises who are not, I would say, credit-worthy counterparties. So you can step in and help them with the counterparty risk. If you think this is not enough, you can even have the state playing a role as a buyer or as a central counterparty. And as one extreme, then I think we end up with David and Malcolm's proposal, which is to have a green power pool or a variant of it, which is actually state-run, or could be run by a party, but in a centralized way. All what I want to show is that, again, you have a spectrum of interventions, and different countries may have different approaches there. So that leads me to my conclusion and next steps, because I think we have an agenda for research for the next 10 years here. First thing, the energy crisis has revealed what we already knew to a large extent. Many of the conditions underpinning the efficient functioning of energy-only markets are not fulfilled in practice. So what do we need? We need a new market model that will internalize policy objectives and likely interventions. That is my response to your opening question, Dominic. What is the goal here? Well, we should build a market that is going to be resilient to the next crisis. Why? Because it will internalize what policymakers want. The second thing is that fundamentally, if we step back, the reform is an opportunity to realign the fundamental misalignments that we have today in Europe. We have an internal market, but we have some responsibilities which remain with member states. For instance, the generation mix, security of supply, and protection of vulnerable customers, which you can define in many different ways, is a national prerogative. So I think this is an opportunity to not hide and really confront with that reality. Second point, hybrid markets, or whatever you call them. Again, there is a developing literature on the academic side on that. We, I think, broadly agree on the principles. Everybody will agree that there needs to be some form of planning. It can be done by the market participants or centrally. Some form of tendering of long-term contracts, again, can be centralized, decentralized. Everybody will agree among economists we need to preserve the acquis, meaning the efficient market in the short term we have. And we will need a framework to pass through the cost. But the difficult questions are not these ones. I think the difficult questions are the devil is in the details, and we need, based on this principle, to understand what are the feasible way forward, the way in which we will not, degrade the efficiency too much. So the four key questions I've summarized here in my presentation are: who defines the system needs? Is that consumers or retailers on behalf of consumers, or is that a central entity? Who is contracting and on what basis? Again, do we have a central party to contract, or can we make it decentralized, voluntary to some extent? What is a product definition? Technology neutral or not? Separate products or multi-attributes? And which type of tariff cost pass-through do we want? And again, do we want that differentiated by consumer or not? So Dominique, I hope I was within 10 minutes. Sorry, Jan, and I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Fabien. These are, of course, very, very thoughtful remarks. One of the points that we will not have the leisure to engage in today, but which I wanted to mention, is that we've been working, as you said, on hybrid markets for quite some time, and the principles haven't changed that much. And now we're sort of moving forward, and I think your questions show that we're making progress. But at the same time, this crisis was pretty much handled, and not so badly handled, by short-term markets. And when I saw a few days ago, Financial Times had an article: gas supply, gas consumption in industry in Europe declined by 25%, with industrial production being at an all-time high. To some extent, markets do work, and short-term markets do work. That doesn't mean that we've been working on something that wasn't important or is not important in the future. And we clearly also had some security of supply constraints, which we would prefer not to have. But nevertheless, the last few months are quite revealing of that short-term element. But of the importance of that short-term element. But we'll have the final intervention this afternoon, which will answer one of your questions indeed. Should it be a central buyer or bilateral contracting? Will be by Dominique Finon and Etienne Baker. The long-term central buyer, a way towards the double decoupling. As always, the time constraint is operative, and that would leave us 5 minutes plus for an exchange with the audience. Dominique, over to you. I said industrial production is at an all-time high. In Europe, yes. True. Yeah. It's a snapshot, and I don't want to overplay it, and would play. Yeah, fair enough. Would need more discussion. Dominique, s'il te plaît.
Ok. Je vais parler en français parce que tu m'as bien précisé que c'était 10 minutes et j'irai plus vite. Donc, I excuse myself to Malcolm. Vous comprenez? Bon. Natalia aussi doit comprendre après son passage. Ok. Donc, d'abord, pour introduire ma présentation, je voulais dire à Fabien que je suis en désaccord avec l'idée d'appeler ça New Hybrid Market. C'est un nouveau régime combinant la planification, on peut l'appeler autrement, et le marché. Pour avoir la concurrence de long terme, il y a quelqu'un qui décide d'attribuer des contrats de long terme à des nouveaux équipements à des dates précises. Et ce quelqu'un, c'est l'État. À partir du moment où on considère que les PPA ne sont pas une voie durable de développement des technologies bas carbone. Donc j'en viens à mon histoire. Alors, je ne l'appelle plus central buyer parce qu'il y a des gens qui disent que c'est un single buyer. Alors aussitôt, quand on parle d'acheteur central, c'est épouvantable. En français, le terme à la limite centrale d'achat me conviendrait mieux. C'est pour ça que je l'ai intitulé Central Trading and Purchasing Agency. Alors, alors, il faut que j'arrive à le faire marcher. Voilà, ça marche. Donc, il y a 3 objectifs qui sont des vrais défis pour une réforme exhaustive. Il y a d'abord, d'un côté, maintenir à tout prix la coordination par les marchés à l'intérieur du système et entre les systèmes avec les market coupling. Le deuxième élément, c'est découpler le signal de court terme des signaux de long terme pour l'investissement dans les technologies bas carbone, parce que les rentes inframarginales sont tellement volatiles qu'il est très difficile, quand on a des technologies très capital intensives, de pouvoir anticiper. Donc il faut un système de contrat de garantie de revenus pour partager les risques. Alors, est-ce à savoir si ça peut être avec des parties privées ou avec l'État? Alors, j'en viendrai tout à l'heure à la critique de ceux qui pensent que les PPA sont une voie durable. Parce que derrière, il y a énormément d'idéologie et ça fausse complètement toute une réflexion rationnelle sur ces sujets-là. Alors ensuite, il y a le troisième élément qui est apparu avec la crise, comment assurer la protection des consommateurs en essayant de trouver un système où ils ont des prix de détail stables, avec une sorte d'alignement avec les coûts de long terme, tout en maintenant une sorte d'équilibre. Donc, d'un côté, on a le maintien de l'intégrité de l'architecture de marché à tous les niveaux. Deuxièmement, la proposition, c'est de créer une entité publique indépendante pour assumer 3 fonctions. En amont, c'est de partager les risques de marché pour les producteurs bas carbone pour investir. Il faut aussi organiser un marché de long terme avec l'allocation de ces contrats par enchère pour maintenir une pression concurrentielle quand c'est possible. Troisième élément, il faut essayer de couvrir le risque, la majeure partie du risque de marché pour les fournisseurs et au-delà pour les consommateurs, puisque la crise a bien mis en évidence le fait qu'il y avait des déficits de couverture de risque du côté des suppliers, mais aussi des consommateurs. Et il faut pour ça instaurer une espèce de mécanisme de transfert des différences avec des contrats de double option. Donc il y a une entité publique qui, dans ce qu'on propose avec Étienne, qui va acquérir aussi l'énergie physique correspondant à celle qui est couverte par les contrats de CFD. Et on peut, par cette méthode-là, définir des prix de transfert entre l'entité publique et les détaillants sur la base des contrats de long terme du mix de bas carbone. Mais le reste, la fourniture des détaillants viendra du spot market. Donc, premier élément, c'est la première partie du decoupling, parce que ce système-là permet de gérer les deux découplings qui sont le thème de ce séminaire. Donc, l'idée, c'est d'abord d'avoir cette agence qui est une Central Trading Agency. Donc, il y a des contrats CFD qui sont passés avec cette agence qui est un central contracteur, et en même temps, toute l'énergie produite par ces équipements vont sur la plateforme de marché. Donc, on a cette public entity. La référence pour moi, c'est la Low Carbon Contract Company au Royaume-Uni, et qui serait en charge de contracter, ce serait la contrepartie. Et derrière, donc, il y a des contrats de long terme, encore une fois, avec les nouveaux équipements. Mais c'est aussi l'idée d'élargir ces CFD aux équipements existants bas carbone. Et j'insiste là-dessus dans la mesure où la Commission européenne, dans un non-paper du 20 octobre, vient de reconnaître l'intérêt de cette histoire pour protéger les consommateurs, pour prendre l'inframarginal rente des consommateurs bas carbone pendant ces épisodes de prix extrêmes dus au prix du gaz. Donc, il y a enfin, vous connaissez le système des CFD où, par rapport au prix de marché et au prix de référence, on rembourse la différence quand les prix de marché sont plus bas et on extrait la différence lorsque les prix de marché sont plus élevés. Et l'intérêt du système, quand on ira vers l'aval, c'est qu'on peut rétrocéder ces rentes aux consommateurs. Donc, il y a l'auctioning des contrats avec aussi, pour certaines technologies particulières, très capitalistiques, avec des très longs délais de développement, de négocier ces contrats avec l'État, mais ensuite, ça sera géré par l'agence. Et après, tous les producteurs vont sur le spot. Alors, j'insiste sur l'intérêt d'avoir une compagnie commerciale qui joue le rôle de chambre de compensation. Ça ne sera pas à l'État de le faire, comme on le fait actuellement en France avec les CCR, avec les contrats de complément de rémunération. L'État, il peut faire ce qu'il veut quand il va récupérer la rente inframarginale. Là, il va y avoir des véritables contrats et qui donneront une vraie crédibilité au mécanisme de transfert. Alors, venons-en au PPA. Donc, j'allais dire, pour faire plaisir à Bruxelles, pour faire plaisir à la CR, à la CER, on va maintenir cette histoire-là. Voilà, parce que comme ça, l'État ne décidera pas de tout, puis on va s'arranger pour de donner des avantages ou de donner des incitations pour qu'il y ait ces contrats. Alors, premier point, ce n'est pas des CFD obligatoires pour les investisseurs bas carbone, j'insiste, donc on ouvre la voie au PPA entre les développeurs low carbone et les larges consommateurs. Il y a des règles pour éviter les comportements opportunistes des développeurs et même des gros acheteurs engagés dans des PPA pour quand ils voient qu'ils perdent de l'argent, ils essayent de retourner vers des CFD. Donc derrière, je suis un petit peu agressif parce que c'est terriblement gênant de voir qu'actuellement, pour qu'on ne discute pas de la possibilité d'avoir ce système de CFD généralisé, on nous balance l'idée que les PPA, ça peut être un développement majeur pour couvrir les risques des investisseurs dans les technologies bas carbone. Et on se demande après quelles sont les motivations des grands acheteurs. Alors actuellement, on nous dit qu'on va avoir des prix stables, après il y a la recherche d'images, etc. Mais en fait, derrière, là, dans le pays où ça marche le mieux, il y a une obligation sur les gros industriels et certains fournisseurs d'avoir une part de sourcing en énergie verte à base de PPA. Et dans d'autres pays, il y a des subsides, il y a des subventions à travers notamment les certificats d'origine. et puis on nous balance le développement aux États-Unis des PPA avec Google et autres. En fait, aux États-Unis, et c'est ce que Paul Josco met dans son avant-dernier papier, il montre que ce n'est pas viable. C'est une obligation que se donnent ces gros acheteurs. Il y a un engagement volontaire de réduire leurs émissions de CO2, et il montre que, et dans cette recherche d'engagement volontaire, il cherche à la respecter en signant des PPA d'énergie verte. Et il y a tout de même quelque chose, et là Fabien dans les papiers de Lexicon le montre bien, c'est qu'il y a en plus dans les corporate PPA du côté des acheteurs un énorme risque pour balancer l'intermittence en allant chercher sur le marché de gros le complément. Actuellement, ceux qui ont des PPA, avec les prix extrêmes sur le spot, ils doivent sentir un petit peu la rationalité de leur choix. Bon, donc j'insiste, pour moi, ça ne peut pas être la route principale. C'est la raison pour laquelle il faut tout de même légitimer la possibilité d'avoir ce modèle de contracting général en CFD avec les investisseurs bas carbone et l'énergie bas carbone. Alors là, je vais rajouter le fait que dans cette histoire, il faut des contrats de capacité qui seraient des espèces de contrats de tolling où on rémunère la capacité, mais où il y a aussi des incitations pour être disponible quand il le faut. Autrefois, dans les mécanismes de capacité, c'était pendant la période critique. Maintenant, c'est toute l'année, pendant les périodes où les productions intermittentes seraient très faibles. Et après, on peut avoir différentes maturités de contrat entre les équipements existants et les équipements neufs. Donc, cette histoire de contrat de capacité, ça peut être fait par l'élargissement des mécanismes de capacité actuels qui existent dans les pays européens. C'est l'Italie et c'est partiellement la France. Mais après, quand l'Allemagne continue de refuser l'idée de mécanismes de capacité de ce type-là, on peut toujours se demander qu'est-ce que les Allemands ont derrière la tête. Donc, on peut aussi élargir ces CRM, ces mécanismes de capacité, aux technologies bas carbone, puisqu'ils ont des potentiels de flexibilité importantes.
Dominique,
oui,
j'ai encore on a dépassé une minute. Parfait.
Non, je n'ai pas une demi-minute, mais en gros, sur le deuxième découpling, l'agence de trading et aussi cette centrale d'achat. Pourquoi? C'est qu'on réalise par ce moyen-là, au niveau de l'acheteur central, toutes les compensations pour que l'acheteur central ait la main sur tous les coûts de long terme des équipements bas carbone, que ce soit les neufs ou les existants. Donc l'objectif ici, c'est d'être capable de revendre les mégawattheures qu'a couvert l'acheteur central, c'est de les revendre en physique aux retailers. Les retailers, après, auront deux sourcing. Donc, il faut que je me dépêche un petit peu. Donc, encore une fois, l'acheteur central assume la majeure partie du sourcing des retailers. Et après, on peut avoir un mode transparent de définition des prix de transfert vers les fournisseurs sur la base des coûts de long terme. Et là, le régulateur pourrait avoir un rôle sur le mode de définition des différents blocs d'énergie. On pourrait même avoir, dans le mode d'acquisition des blocs d'énergie, des enchères descendantes, pour avoir une certaine compétition. Et alors là, je rajoute un élément sur la variabilité possible des offres de prix de vente des retailers à leurs clients selon leurs différents profils de consommation. Ce qu'on peut voir dans ce que je viens de montrer en animant, c'est l'énergie que les fournisseurs doivent se fournir sur le marché, correspond plus ou moins à l'énergie produite par les équipements flexibles et les équipements fossiles de backup. Et donc, pour finir, donc, on a la possibilité d'avoir une variabilité des prix de détail correspondant aux périodes de tension offre-demande sur le marché gros. Et donc, une incitation à développer les contrats avec de la demande response. Et à la fin, ce qu'on peut voir, c'est que la compétition entre les fournisseurs, avec éventuellement des agrégateurs possibles, va correspondre à leur capacité to match leurs différents types de sourcing avec leur offre de prix et de services vis-à-vis de leurs différents clients et qui ont des profils de demande différents. Alors, c'est en refaisant ces slides et en relisant ce qu'écrivait Malcolm, et je ne me souviens plus de votre prénom, David, ça correspond un petit peu à la même démarche, au fond, mais ça se passe à d'autres niveaux et ça me paraît moins artificiel. Alors, je finis, j'ai un slide pour dire, là, avec mon machin, tout le monde est gentil, tout le monde est beau, et ça correspond, d'abord, j'ai mes deux objectifs qui sont remplis, et ensuite, dans le non-paper dont je parlais, la Commission européenne disait « Ah, mais c'est très facile d'imposer ce changement, et ça peut être implanté très rapidement parce qu'il n'y a pas trop d'incompatibilité. » Alors, ce que je veux souligner, c'est que c'est bruxello-compatible. Il y a la compétition en amont sur le marché gros, en aval sur le marché de détail, il y a le market coupling, il y a la liberté des développeurs bas carbone de contracter avec des parties privées si ça les chante, mais moi je pense que les développeurs ils vont comprendre c'est mieux d'aller chercher des CFD comme les gros acheteurs, et les gros acheteurs acheter directement auprès de l'agence et sur le marché gros. Et les mécanismes de capacité sont maintenant considérés comme non temporaires par la DG Comp. Et donc, pour finir, il y a tout de même des petits problèmes là, mais je n'ai pas trop envie de les détailler parce que j'ai dépassé mon temps, mais l'idée principale, c'est qu'il faut tout de même changer l'article 5.2 de la directive parce qu'elle demande la déconnexion. Là, on va avoir une déconnexion des prix de détail, des prix de vente finaux, avec les prix spot sur le marché. Donc c'est comme s'il y avait quelque part une régulation, mais là, en l'occurrence, il y a beaucoup de concurrence, il n'y a pas forcément une vraie régulation. Et la deuxième chose, c'est de changer un petit peu le régime d'aide d'État pour que toutes les technologies bas carbone aient des contrats standardisés. Hein, le nucléaire n'est pas dans le régime d'aide d'État. Et l'obstacle intrinsèque reste qu'au bout du compte, les acheteurs industriels français ou plus largement les acheteurs industriels de pays vertueux, on a fait plein de renouvelables intermittentes qui ont, paraît-il, des coûts très bas, peuvent bénéficier de prix moins élevés que dans le pays d'à côté. Et on voit tout de suite l'objection qu'on peut faire à ce genre de modèle. C'est le problème d'avoir des prix moins chers, des prix industriels moins chers dans certains pays que dans d'autres pays, sans la possibilité pour les consommateurs du pays où les prix sont chers d'acheter auprès de l'agence centrale du pays voisin. Mais on pourrait imaginer qu'il y ait des compensations. Je me souviens que par rapport à l'objection sur le plafond de prix du gaz, le gouvernement français disait on pourrait tout de même avoir des effets, des redistributions entre les pays pour ceux pour qui ça coûterait moins cher parce qu'ils ont moins de production au gaz, etc., etc. Je m'arrête, vous avez vu, je suis passionné.
Non, c'est très clair, Dominique, merci beaucoup. Tu es tellement passionné que parfois il faut te protéger de toi-même. Donc, merci beaucoup. Et donc, nous sommes presque à la pause, mais je voudrais bien donner l'occasion de poser une question ou même deux, s'il y a urgence, s'il y a demande. Il y en a une, s'il vous plaît, bref, de réponse bref, OK. I understand. I don't know to whom that question is addressed. I will say just 2 words. That's okay for you. That's okay for me. That's probably okay for most of us. But some of them, with that under insurance, will go some sort of non-negotiable poverty line, and then we do have a problem. But for everybody above it, I completely agree with you. I would agree with you. But yes, please.
I just had one comment on the precious wholesale market, as it has been qualified by Fabien. Most of the presentation, especially the first 3 presentations, took for granted that the wholesale market is based on short-term marginal cost. But it is absolutely not true. If it was on short-term marginal cost, then the price of electricity would be today 200 euros per megawatt hour, which is already absurd, as Mr. Le Maire would say, that the price is 400 euro per megawatt hour. So we don't have the wholesale market working on short-term marginal cost. We don't even have this.
We'll leave this as a statement. We'll not provide a full answer. There were 2 more questions or comments briefly, and then we'll break for the break.
Oh. Did you understand the first? No? So, when you speak about the centralized approach and the central trading agency, do you think at the country level or the Europe level?
I'm sorry, je préfère parler en français.
I speak French.
I suppose so. J'en ai volontairement pas parlé. Mais ce que je propose, c'est un mode de réappropriation par les États membres de leur choix de mix. Parce qu'il faut un planificateur qui soit rationnel avant qu'il y ait les interférences politiques. Et au niveau européen, on ne peut pas dire que les prescriptions européennes soient rationnelles. À partir du moment où il y a des pays qui refusent le nucléaire, on ne peut pas avoir de politique énergétique commune, de politique électrique commune. Et on a vu ce que ça peut avoir comme effet. Plus vous mettez de renouvelables intermittentes à zéro cost, zéro marginal cost dans un système, plus ça va être difficile de rentabiliser les centrales nucléaires dans le futur, comme ça dévalorise les centrales nucléaires en place.
Non, je comprends bien, mais vous faites comment pour les échanges entre pays? Je ne suis pas un spécialiste. Hein,
non, mais quelle est la question? La question, c'est de savoir si les Allemands ont un intérêt à prendre en compte les intérêts des autres ou pas. Je déforme la question volontairement. Je la caricature. Mais de penser qu'on ferait une planification européenne, ben pour moi, c'est absolument insensé. Il n'y a pas de légitimité et il y a un article du traité de Lisbonne qui dit que les États peuvent choisir d'exercer leur souveraineté sur le choix du mix. Donc
le Central Trading Agency, c'est au niveau national.
Oui, non, mais à côté, ce n'est pas elle qui fait la planification. Hein. Il y aurait comme c'est le cas au Brésil, comme c'est le cas dans l'Ontario, comme ça pourrait être le cas en France avec une filiale de RTE. On a besoin d'une planification faite sur une base, une programmation faite sur une base impartiale. C'est les scénarios de RTE du début de l'année, de Futur 2050, où ils ont démontré qu'ils étaient capables d'impartialité. À ce moment-là, on peut discuter, on peut regarder. Et après, pour le court moyen terme, on peut avoir une programmation correspondant à ces images, l'image du futur qu'on a choisie, et après on peut enclencher des enchères pour faire tant ou tant de solaire photovoltaïque. Moi, je ne pense pas qu'on puisse avoir des enchères... oui, attends, j'ai fini. Des enchères multitechnologies.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Natalia, who will not be able to join us after the break, will leave her the last word, and we will take that up during the coffee break bilaterally. Natalia.
Yeah, thank you, Jan. Just very quick on one of the questions regarding the performance of short-term energy markets. There can be two reasons for which current prices are above the marginal cost of the marginal price setting plant. One of them is market power. I believe when I said that the long-run contracts complement the short-run markets, I meant this because when firms are subject to fixed price contracts, they have weaker incentives to exercise market power, given that that is not going to benefit the plants that receive a fixed price. So by relying more on long-term contracts at fixed prices or at prices that are closer to be fixed, then we would be mitigating the incentives to exercise market power. Therefore, we would contribute to a better performance of the short-run markets. Current prices can also be above short-term marginal cost because there are some scarcity rents. When we are paying capacity providers capacity payments, there's no need for them to make scarcity rents, given that their investment costs are being recovered through the capacity payments. So in this sense, I truly believe that the long-run contracts will make the short-term markets perform better and therefore provide this short-run efficient price signal. And just if I may, a final word, I have to say that I'm very much in line with the approach of Dominique. Indeed, my proposal, without having really worked together, is very much in line with what he's proposing. I just want to add something on the PPAs. I'm fully in line with his idea that PPAs do not provide the answer for all the reasons that he mentioned, but also for an additional one that I believe has not been discussed before, which is the fact that there's extremely symmetric bargaining powers between the parties. So even if large buyers can contract bilaterally with large sellers, there's no guarantee that these lower prices are going to be passed on to the prices of the final consumers, which is what we really want. So by having a central buyer or by having the state or a low carbon entity, you name it, that represents all consumers, we guarantee that their stronger bargaining power is really shared among all of us and not just among the very few large buyers that are able to exercise their bargaining power with no need to share it with the rest of consumers. Having said this, I'm very sorry that I cannot share the coffee break with you, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you very much. Very apt end of this session. Yes, this concludes the session. We'll go to the coffee, and afterwards it will be Boris who will take over. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I suggest we start.
So good afternoon, everybody. We resume our conference. So this beginning of afternoon, the first session, we talk a lot about the upstream side of the market. So now let's turn to the downstream part and the retail market with this question, which is how to decouple retail prices from consumer costs, retail prices and consumer costs from the wholesale market and the wholesale prices. We will have three excellent panelists in this session, so let me briefly introduce them. So first we'll have Michael Pollitt. I guess that Michael is online, he will participate remotely. So Michael is a professor of business economics at the Judge Business School of Cambridge University. Hello, Michael, can you hear us? I hope so.
Yes, I can. Hello, everyone.
Perfect. Then we have Claire Bergensley. Claire is assistant professor of economics at the Technological University of Denmark. Hi, Claire. And finally, we have Tim Schittekate. Tim is a postdoctoral affiliate at the Sloan School of Management at the MIT. So thanks for being with us, Tim, also, and thanks to the three of you for accepted to participate. I have been strongly asked to remind you that you will have only 10 minutes to speak, so I really thank you in advance if you can respect your time quota. Thank you very much, and without further comments, I will leave the floor to Michael. So Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for letting me hear the speakers that I've been commenting on. Bert has already mentioned the work that we've been doing together for CEER, so I'm drawing on some of the work that we've been doing for the Centre on Regulation in Europe on the future of market design, both for wholesale and for retail markets. But I'm just going to pick out a few points on the retail side in this talk. So you might be interested in some numbers. First thing to say is what has happened to wholesale prices is historically unprecedented, as I'll show in a minute. It's unprecedented in the history of the European electricity market, and it would be expected to have a very big impact on final retail prices for both gas and for electricity. So in the UK, you'd expect the price to go up by about a factor of 5, the retail price. And well, lucky for me, it's only gone up by a factor of 2.5. If you look at the historical plot, and so here's heating prices back, so I'm cheating and using coal up to 1960 and then gas from 1960. The price per unit of energy for gas is at historically unprecedented real levels. And for electricity, so this is after adjusting for bill reductions, for rebates that are paid back through the bill, and which effectively reduce the retail price. The real price of electricity in the UK is back to levels not seen since the 1930s, when there was mass electrification of households going on. So, you know, one important point to say whenever we talk about market design and market redesign in Europe is we are in an exceptional situation, and therefore actions which we take now could be exceptional, and market design and can be separated from longer run questions about market design. And I think there is a general confusion of the two, both in the minds of many academics and in the minds of many politicians. You know, for instance, many ideas which were really bad about how to redesign the wholesale market for electricity, such as the two market solution, which we've just heard. You know, that was a really bad idea when it was first proposed, and it's still a really bad idea as a long-run solution. So we need to keep these two things in mind, that these could be two separable things that we need to talk about, the short run and the long run. We have done a lot of work on this. There is a report both on the retail market and on the wholesale market, and you are all invited to the final public presentation of our CEER work on wholesale market design, 200 plus pages of analysis, of which I'll just pick out a few points. Okay, there clearly is something to be done in retail markets, and the key thing to be done is to get demand down. That is the #1 priority in European markets at the moment. And the fact that we haven't had mass pan-European national advertising campaigns to reduce energy demand this winter is a major public policy failure on the part of almost all governments in Europe. And the fact that the European Commission hasn't prioritized this more is also a failure on the part of the Commission. The other thing that we should be doing, given that we're in a wartime situation, is prioritizing the installation of a lot of distributed generation and, of course, energy efficiency measures, none of which are at record levels, which you would expect them to be at. They're not at historically record levels in the UK, even though our prices have gone up virtually more than anyone else across Europe. We've also seen relatively little innovation in the use of smart meters to manage demand across Europe, though there's some beginning to happen. Of course, we need to combine demand reduction with equitable energy bills. The German proposal to essentially give cheap gas to households up to a point, but then to expose the final 30% of gas consumption to a market-based price, that's a really sensible two-part tariff solution, which both addresses the equity issue, but maintains the marginal incentive to reduce demand, which is the priority. And of course, the other thing that should be happening is an integration of welfare schemes and electricity retailing, such that we can target the free or cheap allocation of electricity on customers according to their household characteristics. So if you've got more children, elderly person in the household, somebody who's chronically sick, you are automatically getting a bill adjustment for that. And that is not happening in most European countries, as far as I'm aware. But that would be an obvious thing to do, and more needs to be done on that, rather than giving free allocations of or cheap allocations of electricity and gas to everyone, regardless of their household or welfare characteristics. Some combination of exposure to real-time pricing and long-term hedges would seem to be a good idea. In the UK, we, of course, recirculate the benefits that we're getting from our long-term CFD contracts directly back to customers within the CFD contract. Why every other country in Europe isn't already doing that, well, you tell me, because it was the obvious way to set that up. Of course, the retail market has basically collapsed for households across Europe. And of course, one of the reasons it's collapsed is because of most regulators were asleep on the job and weren't doing proper financial regulation of retailers. And of course, subjecting retailers to better stress testing, though of course the stress test is an extreme stress test. And of course, beyond that, proper stress testing of retailing, customers should have been to some extent exposed to the costs of being with a retailer that was poorly hedged. And shouldn't have been bailed out at no cost to the customer. Indeed, what happened in the UK was customers who weren't with irresponsible retailers had to pay the bankruptcy costs of the customers who were, which seems extremely unfair. And of course, getting that trade-off right between proper financial regulation and consumer protection and promoting competition, that is a priority for energy regulators, and it's of course what we pay regulators for. So, you know, European regulators needed to pay more attention to that. Yeah, and you know, good commercial practices in retailing are something that national regulators might prioritize, but requirements for hedging is something that could be standardized to some extent at a European level. Okay, just to conclude, we are in a war we must win. And, you know, things that we do in the short term to keep the lights on and keep the gas flowing aren't necessarily things that we want to do in the long term. We've had an unprecedented stress test to European energy markets, but we've also had a foretaste of some of the aspects of net zero. There will be coupling of electricity and heat and transport markets in net zero. There will be high unit prices of energy. There will be high carbon prices, and there probably won't be any missing money. That's all of those things have been illustrated by this crisis. But how we put the retail markets back together, well, nobody's talked about that, but it's going to be pretty difficult given the high levels of fiscal subsidy that are currently going into retailing. We've heard today some of the proposals that have been made for how we manage the crisis. A lot of them are not new, and whether they were good or bad was true before the crisis, and almost none of them are radical. I mean, what Natalia was talking about, what Dominique was talking about, we do all this already in the UK. Okay, so none of those ideas are new. And of course, having more CFDs, you know, that idea seems to have had a bit of a boost, but the idea of having more locational marginal pricing and more exposure to marginal pricing, that seems to have not had a boost. And as I put in the chat, you know, one of the, you know, the major question is to the degree to which you want intervention, the degree to which you want to sign long-term contracts on behalf of customers, not really the fact that some might be a good idea. And of course, what's the responsibility of Europe versus national member states taking their own individual decisions about the contract position they want their customer base to have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael, for having perfectly respected your time quota. Effectively, there is a huge challenge to bring back the consumers on the retail market and make them more active in their participation to this market. And when you say the retail markets are suspended, yes, it is the case, especially in France, where we have frozen the retail rates for end consumers. So it's a huge challenge. And thanks for bringing this to the audience. So next, Claire. You have 10 minutes. The floor is yours.
Sure.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you very much, boys. Thank you also, Fabien, for inviting me today. I'm very thrilled to be here. And as a very quick disclaimer, the topic of this presentation is a little bit different from what you've been hearing so far, because I'm not talking about electricity markets at all, but I'm talking about how grid tariff may affect end users and how we can have fair grid tariff in the future in our journey to decarbonization. So hopefully I have Boris who will have the opportunity to make the link between my presentation and the rest of those presentations after I speak, so thank you already. So yeah, one more study about grid tariff design, but this one has a little twist because, as I said, the contribution of that study is to look into something that we call a redistribution instrument, so that the poorest ones in society are not the one bearing most of the costs that are driven by electrification in households. I co-wrote this study together with other colleagues from DTU and with people from the Rotterdam School of Management. To start, to start with, I mean, the study started with a general observation that what is driving decarbonization in households is investment into heat pumps or electric cars. At the same time, those ones who can afford those equipments are also usually the ones who have the financial means to investing into them. At the same time, those equipment are the ones driving the costs up, costs that everybody pays, system grid costs, because that's the way it is, regardless of whether or not they have access to heat pump and electric car. Long story short, we see that there is a growing risk along with the ownership of those equipment driven by, or let's call them rich people. There is a growing risk to see a societal gap widening between the poorest ones and the wealthier ones in society. So what we try to do in this paper here is to strike a balance between different targets that grid tariff should have. Tariff of economic efficiency, the principle of economic efficiency, of course, making sure that the system operator can cover his entire costs. And as I said, we developed this redistribution scheme that we add on to very business as usual kind of grid tariff designs. Okay. That was for the why question, and the what question is basically what you see here. What we did is, because we're dealing with fairness and energy justice, it is necessary to look to get a large sample of households, right? So by the way, we work with a Danish case study, because Denmark is a gold mine when it comes to getting data. So we got access to a lot of data for individual households. So our first task was to divide those households into poor or low financial status, high financial status, and whatever is in between, middle class basically. Then we develop our tariff scenarios and our redistribution mechanism. I'll get back to that in a couple of slides. Very briefly about the data, we got access to 1.4 million individual smart meters showing hourly demand for 1 full year in 2017, thanks to the Danish TSO Energinet. Along with those hourly meter data comes a meter ID. With this meter ID comes an individual address that we can find also on a public registers from Denmark Statistics. So basically for every individual hourly load for 1 full year, we know whether the household lives in a house or an apartment, what is the size of his or her dwelling, how many people live there, how much money they make, and we know, of course, whether they have a heat pump or an electric car, at least back in 2017. So we link that all together, and long story short, we used a multi-criteria method to categorize our users into low, medium, and high financial status with or without heat pump. With heat pump, with EV, or with none of these. And just to give you a very brief illustration of what we mean here by low financial status household with a heat pump, while we consider all those, right? All those households living either in a house or in an apartment of the smallest size, belonging to the smallest income bracket, up to 2 people, and with a heat pump, most obviously. At the end of the day, we end up with this distribution of households. 18% of Danish households in our sample belonging to the vulnerable households, 18 to the richest, and the 2 remaining third to the middle class households. Right, so that was for our consumer grouping. Now comes the grid tariff. We did something extremely simple. We do not reinvent the wheel. We departed from the tariff base or used in Denmark in 2017, regular two-part tariff with a subscription payment and a volumetric fee. And what we did was just a sensitivity between the relative share paid with the subscription part and the volumetric part. And at the end of the day, we also included a very, very simple time of use on the volumetric part. So these are 5 grid tariff designs. Extremely simple, but we can show some very nice things with it. Now about the redistribution factor, our little contribution to science here. What we did, again, is rather simple. We consider that the subscription payment, when there is a subscription payment, paid by those households belonging to the most vulnerable category, is either partly or entirely paid by the others, by the rich and middle class. And we use a reallocation that goes by steps of 10%. So 10% of the subscription part is paid by the other 20, 30, all the way up to 100%, where at the end of the day, we mean a complete cross-subsidization of the subscription fee from the poorest ones to the other ones. And that's how it looks like. At this stage, I just want to stress that even though we develop the skeleton for the tariff design, never ever do we set the volumetric fee nor the subscription part. What we build is an Excel easy simulation tool where we depart from the entire revenue collected by the system operator in 2017. So we have this plate that never changes regardless of the tariff we implement, and we just reallocate it based on the grid tariff scheme. So basically, that thing is revenue neutral. First equation is about the 5 grid tariffs, subscription versus volumetric heavy, and the second equation is about the redistribution factor. Good, so let's jump to the results. First of all, okay, here we do not reinvent the hot water, but we show this effect with a nice level of detail. Volumetric heavy tariffs penalize large consumers, most obviously because they consume a lot, and especially those ones with a heat pump and electric car, and the richest. And subscription heavy tariffs penalize the low financial status household. The reason for this is that a fully subscription-based tariff just basically takes the entire revenue from the system operator and divides it by the number of connections. So everybody pays the same, and we understand why it may not be so equal or fair for those ones who have a small consumption in the end to pay as much as those big ones. What is interesting here is that we show some very large spillover effects between those ones who own those advanced equipment and between poor and rich households. Okay, with subscription heavy tariffs, the wealthiest household owning those equipment, they actually have their bills. They are the ones benefiting the most from this mechanism, while with the volumetric tariff, the most vulnerable ones are the ones actually subsidizing the grid costs, and especially in front of those, the richest grid users. But okay, the literature is you can find this in the literature. What is interesting is to have the detail in Denmark, so we got a lot of our Danish stakeholders were pretty interested to see this. Now I'll show you a snapshot of what happens when we introduce a full cross-subsidization of the subscription payment by the middle class and richest households. So here, just only pay attention to those blue bars that show the poorest ones. The thing that stands out here, and I will go into the detail in the next slide, what stands out here is that if we entirely pass this cost from the poor ones to the others, the impact on those vulnerable households is significant. While it doesn't change so much what is paid by the richest ones and the middle income households. Again, this is not rocket science, it's just a mass effect. So basically, we're passing one cost that is initially paid by 20% of the population, and that is then redistributed among 80%. So just a mass effect. I'll get back to this mass effect in the conclusion. Now let's look into the impact of that redistribution factor more into detail. Boris, how many minutes do I have left? 3 minutes. Awesome. So this is a warm-up slide. And it is just intended to read it together with you in a simple manner, because on the next slide we will have more of this. So what you can see here on the y-axis here is the difference of yearly grid payment paid by a given household compared to the base case, right? So this medium income household would pay 10% more, 20% less as compared to. The user group is further subdivided between whether this middle class income or group owns an electric car, heat pump, or none of the above. We see the 5 different grid tariff designs further divided by the redistribution factor. And just so that it is clear, when you see a 0 here, it means that, even though it's not necessarily intuitive, it means that the subscription fee is entirely paid by the richest ones. Okay. Yes? And this is what we end up finding. Good. I will just zoom on the 2 results that I find the most interesting in this study. First of all, we see that there is no need to implement a large redistribution mechanism to alleviate the overcosts potentially borne by those low financial status households. Actually, we show that only 10 to 20% subsidization is enough to protect, to shield those users against higher grid bill. At this level of redistribution, there is a minor impact on the bill paid by the other ones, by those who subsidize this cost. And to give you very briefly an order of magnitude, if we take the 25% volumetric tariff, so 75 subscription, subsidizing the low financial status household by only 10% alleviates all additional costs compared to the base case, to that category of users, while only increasing the medium and financial status groups by 3%. So it's fairly marginal. Something that we didn't expect to see, but now thinking retrospectively, I think that we could have anticipated these results. Nevertheless, I think it's very interesting to see implementing this kind of instrument can potentially have a big toll taken by middle-class households. And that's why if one day a regulator decided to utilize our technique here, the calibration of this tool should be fairly well understood and tested well in advance. Okay, that was for the main results. Now a couple of conclusions. Yes, we can hit energy justice target in tariff design. What we show here is that it is with a subscription-heavy tariff, a time-based. Here it is a time of use, but we could think of another cost component, right? And the low redistribution factors, we can strike a balance between, again, energy justice, revenue adequacy, and better cost reflectiveness, at least with this time-based signal. It is fairly simple and transparent, or maybe it's not yet fully transparent to you right now, but I can assure you that it is extremely simple to do, and just an Excel file and some good data can, make this tested and working. However, maybe the ones working for regulators and others here in the room, you may have already found out that this is nice. I mean, we like very much what we are doing here. We're very excited about this mechanism, but the problem is, and this is a major disclaimer to this study, it doesn't fit with current legal framework set at the European level. The reason for this is because it is neither in the mandate of regulators, nor of DSOs to implement this kind of mechanism. It is not the role of grid tariff to drive more fairness, and especially not across income groups. However, there is a leeway. And the leeway is in here. Maybe you've noticed in my way of categorizing my grid users that what I did here is absolutely brutal. I mean, what I call a low financial status household, 20% of Denmark are not poor, not at all. But I'm missing enough data to be able to capture those ones in the population that are actually in situation of energy poverty. When I get access to more data and when I can narrow down what I mean by low financial status to actually target those ones who are in situation of precarity, energy precarity, then this kind of instrument can work within current national regulations and within the EU legal framework. So that's for future work, I guess. Of course, we must be able to better define what we mean by energy poverty and to better capture those one households, which means that huge work is needed to actually be able to connect those hourly consumption to who is behind this meta and to get a profile of those households if we want to implement this kind of mechanism. And yes, and of course, when I said that we had this mass effect that the impact on poor households, the impact of my mechanism on poor households was significant, while the impact in terms of increased grid bill on those richest, wealthiest households was marginal. But then if we go from a low financial status of 20% of the population down to 2 or 3%, then this impact, this beneficial impact on the poorest ones and the marginal impact on the richest one will be even more moderate. And that's how I conclude my presentation today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Claire. It's really interesting. I'm sure that you have a lot more of results that you will be happy to share with the audience if I ask. And we see that the energy transitions come with plenty of undesirable and effects and cross-subsidization effects between poor and rich people. We have the same thing with the development of solar panel, and you show pretty well, and your demonstration is convincing, that we can ensure fairness in the grid tariff with a limited the transfer between consumers, and it will be not so hurting for rich people. So thanks so much for that. So we see that we have to ensure a consumer that they participate effectively and deeply in the functioning of the market. They have to pay the true cost for energy. We have to ensure that the price they pay are fair and ensure the justice for consumers, but also we have to make sure that prices paid by household, by firms are affordable. So that's the next issue we will discuss with Tim. So Tim, you have 10 minutes, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Boris. Thank you, Fabien, for bringing me to Paris. I always like to be back on the old continent. So I will present some work that you can also find online. We already published 2 working papers about that, and a third one will come this week, a fourth one hopefully before Christmas, all about the energy crisis and potential solutions, rather in the longer run than more in the short run. I start with a diagnosis of the problem. I use a Flemish saying, which is said, calling a cow a cow. I know that in English it's calling a spade a spade. I don't know how you say it in French, but at least it awakes the crowd. What we observe is that there is radical calls to overthrow the market compound, the market design that has been built up over many years. But the diagnosis of the current situation, at least my diagnosis and those of my co-authors, is that marginal pricing or marginal prices have reached never experienced high sustained levels. And maybe more important is that much earlier than expected, renewables are actually the cheapest resource to invest in. And if you would invest in renewables tomorrow and nobody would intervene too hard into spot prices, you can actually make a lot of money. Ideally, that would give a situation where there's flooding in of massive amount of gigawatts, tens of gigawatts of renewables tomorrow, and the whole situation would be solved. But unfortunately, there's a lot of entry barriers, market incompleteness, and therefore there is a political desire to allow end users to somehow benefit from those reduced costs of renewables, which is something that you currently cannot do with the existing market design, at least not at the speed that some politicians would want. So that is my diagnosis of the situation. So first, what should we do? What shouldn't we do? Well, I wouldn't try to fix what ain't broken, which is another English saying. I prefer the opinion on the guy on the right-hand side, William Hogan from Harvard, who says that marginal pricing in real time, we will need even more tomorrow than we already need today. I would not like to split the market or blow up the market, because I think if you make certain resources blind for what goes on into the system, the whole costs will increase. Basically, I don't like the violation of the law of one price. Maybe I'm indoctrinated, but I think in real time, in a certain location, the price of each electron is the same. It does not matter which resource has produced that particular electron. And the moment you violate that rule, everything goes wrong when you start propagating from there. What has not been working is market incompleteness. We have always been talking about issues with generators. They don't find enough long-term contracts, there's too much uncertainty, they don't invest in new resources. What we have been focusing on is then capacity remuneration mechanisms, basically protecting generation from sustained periods of low prices. What we have never done is somehow think about that scenario that suddenly prices could be very high for a certain moment. So the kind of the other side of the medal of not protecting or of somehow of not hedging enough at the generator side means that your consumers are exposed when you have these sustained shocks. So that is the problem. Now, it is nothing new that somehow the energy-only market or just leaving over everything to the market is not something that necessarily works. On the left-hand side, you can see a famous economist, on the right-hand side, a less famous economist, but they both say the same thing. Basically, that sometimes it is worth proactively intervening in a market in order to avoid the political costs when things go very much wrong. C'est quoi? Ok, ça va.
Dominique, s'il vous plaît, laissez-le terminer et puis pour intervenir après, pour discuter
après,
calmement.
Je comprends français, oui.
Tim, feel free, go on.
Yeah, okay, so there have been different issues in the past that require different solutions. A very known issue has that there's been uncertainty for financing new investments. We have introduced capacity mechanisms. Many parts of the world, the EU, the US, Latin America. There have been problems with the market delivering resiliency. We have mandated certain resiliency requirements. Think about Puerto Rico, think about Texas. The market does not deliver decarbonization. Somehow, because of the business case, innovation spillovers, we have introduced or complemented the market with feed-in tariffs, CFD auctions, tax credit. The issue today is affordability. There is insufficient use and availability of hedges. And the solution to that is somehow procure a sort of insurance for a subset of consumers. Now, what do we propose in our work? Well, if you think about a certain contract that would protect consumers from sustained periods of high prices, it would mean a monthly settled call option with a strike price equal to the bill cap. And I will explain the choices for that. Why an option? Because we want to protect consumers against high bills. We don't want to fix their prices. Why monthly settled? We want to protect consumers against high bills, not high hourly prices. Why centralized? That's maybe open for discussion. You can also do it decentralized, transparency, less coordination needed. What is the volume? A central entity determines on behalf of a certain subset of consumers how much of that insurance you should procure. Because retailers are not going to do it and consumers are not going to do it out of themselves. Who will be the seller of those options? Technology agnostic, but physically and financial backup required. This could be a contract of 5 to 10 years. Basically, the cost of that insurance is basically like a renewable levy. It's a sort of cost that anybody would pay, or you can bring it to the state budget. It is an insurance. An insurance does not come for free, so the cost has to be allocated. The moment these options are activated, you get a sort of lump sum payment that can be used to somehow mitigate affordability impacts for consumers. This option has been featured by the European Commission in their communications, by Acer, by The Economist, and by Bloomberg. Now, how does it work? This is a very simple example from Spain. Imagine you have an option with a strike price at 100. During a snowstorm, the average monthly price is actually not 100, even though during certain hours it increases. It's above 100, so therefore you don't exercise the option. During the crisis, prices are on average above 100. The difference of that is 139 in this case. If you would have contracted 300 kilowatt hour per vulnerable consumers, it means as the regulator you collect 42 euro in this case, and you can use that to mitigate bill impact. So basically the regulator is on the other side of the contract, and then he decides how to allocate somehow that basically inframarginal rent that is captured, but it's on a market-based way and pre-agreed and not as a sort of retroactive action as we see today. So it's basically a revenue cap, but pre-agreed and very well implemented. Now, how to procure that option from certain generators? Well, there are two big choices, and this is really where I think the market reform will be about. First, if you connect to the network. We used to have a system where it's first come, first serve. You bring in a sort of documenté or documents, and you can have your connection. Right now, what we see already more and more is auctions for access, because access becomes a scarce good, and every economist knows that if you have a scarce good, you preferably allocate it in a market-based way and don't do first come, first serve. The second is more controversial. Right now, if you enter the market at transmission level, often you can choose. You find your own counterparty, you go for an auction, or you go merchant. You could also in the future say, and this is getting rid of third-party access, that you need to, when you have a new connection, at the same time you need to bundle a long-term hedge with that connection. So basically, first come, first serve, I think in the future will be dead. Whether merchant will be dead, and this is orange, this is, I think, a very big question to ask, because merchants right now, they will earn a lot of money, and if you would bundle auctions for access with auctions for long-term contracts, like we, for example, already do for offshore wind, but we don't generalize it, what you do is you have an automatic protection from the counterside, which is often the government or the regulator. So basically, contracts for new entrants, counterparty could be government or market parties. It's a pool for long-term contracts. If you want, it's an option, 10 to 15 years. The objective is risk sharing. So not only risk protection from the generator side, but also consumer side without interfering. There are two options. You can go to CFDs, as many have proposed, but they have to be designed very well. If you don't want to go to that world where you completely get rid of the merchant, you can also procure these affordability options, because it gives more options for these new entrants to somehow sell the remainder of their energy bilaterally or via some sort of contracts. How do you put the volume for those contracts? You want to decouple the volumes in the contracts from the actual production in order to minimally interfere with the short-term dispatch, and there are certain solutions for that. What is the settlement frequency? Preferably monthly or alike, because that reduces a bit the risks for both parties. The problem is the moment you do that, it's hard to be technology agnostic. You create increased risk for renewables, but they would be more efficient when they are into the market. And maybe that increased risk is not necessarily a problem because there's a higher demand for connections than there are actual connections, and therefore they would compete to get that connection. How to engage with existing generation, there's a problem, because the revenue cap that we have right now, it cannot, it should not, it will not, maybe it will, last forever. So the pace of these new entrants, which somehow come in some countries they are already, who protect the consumer side, it might not be enough to protect us within 5 or 7 or 8 years for another shock that might arrive. An option A, which some propose, is to force or negotiate contracts with incumbents. I would say that's not the preferred option, depends on the country you are. Option B is to organize an auction for the sale of these options. And basically the regulator would then think, what is the demand for these options? How many consumers do I want to protect? How much protection do I already have in the form of contracts? How much more do I need to procure in order to be protected against the next shock? The insurance on the longer run will cost more than doing nothing, but sometimes the average only matters when you survive along the road. So this is the principle of insurance. So the two Q&A of my talk: why is there a call for a market reform? Because there's a political desire for end users to more directly benefit from reduced cost. I don't say that's good or bad, I just say that is my observation. What does the crisis teach us? Not that spot markets are broken, they can definitely be improved, but they're not the reason that we're seeing these problems. The issue is that long-term markets, they have never worked, we have to find a solution there. I think we might need to rethink rules around third-party access. This is a very sensitive topic, and we need to improve consumer protection to avoid shooting of the messenger, killing the spot market. Maybe what that is meant with decoupling, I don't know. And what we do here in our papers in this presentation is we do a proposal how to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tim, and congrats for having finished your presentation despite these difficult conditions. You can see how the debate could be passionate.
At least I raised some interest. No?
Yeah, really resilient. So as we can see, there is room for a smart regulation in electricity markets where we combine the functioning of markets with well-designed intervention, completely integrate in the wholesale market. So thank you very much for that. We have still a few minutes for some questions from the room, maybe. Yes, Etienne.
Je vais parler en français, je préfère.
But Tim completely understand and speak French. So.
No, it's a question about c'est sur la tarification réseau. En fait, j'ai pas tout compris. Vous m'excuserez parce que j'étais peut-être pas assez attentif sur la redistribution, mais l'électricité, c'est quand même un produit particulier, surtout en ce qui concerne les réseaux, où on a une part puissance et une part énergie. Et je voulais savoir, et de plus en plus, avec des systèmes décarbonés, et puis dans le réseau, où les coûts marginaux sont très faibles, est-ce que vous prenez plus en compte la part puissance que la part énergie, ou est-ce que vous avez travaillé simplement sur l'énergie?
Oui.
Dis Claire, tu peux...
Yes, en anglais. Yes, thank you for the question. No, we are very well aware of this. We review those other tariffs, but we do not include it in our work. And the reason for this is that it was not the main focus point. And actually, we departed from the belief. I mean, that this can be debated, of course. That as of today, the dominant grid tariff design is based on this two-part tariff, and we wanted to offer something that is as close as what is already implemented, generally speaking. But I agree with you, it would be interesting to see how capacity charge or different cost component embedded in the tariff would affect those results. But no, we were most interested into this redistribution element. So no, we didn't test it.
Thanks, Claire. Yes, please.
I had a question about calling a cow or a cat a cat. Actually, it is not for you, it is more for Michael. He said that the solution is to win a war. But I was not sure about which war you were talking about. Was it about corrosion under pressure? Was it about taking over gas fields in Russia or in Norway? So just can you be more explicit about which war you were talking about as a solution to our problems?
Yeah, that's a great question. What I've been doing recently is reading the literature on the 1930s energy policy and energy policy in the 1940s in the UK. And of course, what comes across very clearly there is when the Second World War started, the UK was actually prepared. It had rationing coupons issued. It did ration coal. It did not ration electricity, and electricity demand continued to rise very quickly during the war because people switched to electric heating. They migrated to unregulated fuels. So if we need to recognize this is an exceptional situation and we need wartime policies for it. Okay, and that is about getting demand down while maintaining incentives, so it's fine to control the price to some extent, but it's essential that we get demand down. And so a lot of the proposals that people are making are not targeted on getting demand down, which is the number one thing to get us through this period, and accelerating supplies. So that's what I meant by that. This requires a different mode of thinking to the sorts of standard questions around market design.
Thank you very much, Michael. There is a question on the right, Fabien. Laurent?
Good. Yes. So, I understand your preferred option is B, and I understand why. But then auctioning the affordability options, have you an idea of who will be the seller how they will propose a price with the huge and hard to probabilize the risk they are taking. If they promise to say, let's say, 100, when the price on the short-term market may be 1,000.
Tim, before you answer the question, I'll leave you some time to think about the math in the question of Florent, and we take the questions from Fabien.
Well, thank you for great presentations. Michael, question for you first. You said, and I agree, that there could be forward hedging obligations on suppliers, and that there could be a role at the EU level to at least, standardize or coordinate some of that. One of the questions I'm wrestling with at the moment is how concretely do you define such obligation? So I don't know if you have some thoughts on that. It's a tricky one. Tim, a question for you as well on the insurance. Consumers are diverse, so it's likely that it's not going to be one size fits all. You may want to buy different levels of insurance depending on the price as well. So have you thought of an approach which would provide a menu with some self-selection from consumers?
Maybe any other questions before we let the speakers answer? No? So Tim, please.
Thank you for the question about who would be selling those options. I mean, the parties who would be selling those options, they would be so-called natural hedged, right? So it could be, for example, if you do it, and that is a bit one of the risks that, imagine a gas generator. Right now, it's very hard to buy long-term gas contracts. But maybe also there's no need for a gas generator today to buy long-term gas contracts because the risk of high prices is not something that they are very afraid of. The moment prices go very high, they just pass it through via the spot electricity price or whatever. The moment you transfer the risk from high prices from the consumer, who has very little means of dealing with it, to a generator who might have more means of dealing with it, it might better protect itself against those high prices, and you ignite a sort of chain of hedging at the supply side, which is currently not necessarily the case, at least not against high prices. It could be renewables who buy now a battery and they sell a certain volume, and they know that when prices are very high for a very long time, they will receive enough inframarginal rent in order to pay out that option, and that option could offer them a sort of stabilized revenue stream rather than depending on uncertain very high prices, which are a function of what happens in the fossil fuel markets, at least today and the next 10 years. So it's definitely a big difficulty. At the same time, also, you would not contract the entire demand. And that goes to the question of Fabien. Who do you contract for? Preferably for maybe residential consumers, maybe vulnerable consumers. Residential consumers are about, what, 1/3 of total load? Vulnerable consumers are maybe 1/10 of total load. The only idea of that is when things go really bad, you don't have to do retroactively action, but at least you have a market-based mechanism to collect some of those inframarginal rent. So, and that is really a national choice. Like, who do you contract? To Fabien's question, do you only do vulnerable? Do you do residential? Do you allow opt-out? Do you allow opt-in? Everything to be decided, but the moment you allow opt-out and opt-in based on a price, the auction becomes very complicated because you do not necessarily know the quantity, you do not necessarily know the price, and you need some smart tricks to work that out, but it's not the first time that that kind of problem occurs. So is it easy to do? No. Is the alternative to basically expropriate certain companies? Is that the alternative? Maybe, yes. If you can do it politically, go for it. But if you want to do it in a market-based way and you want an insurance and that is really the objective that you want to have, then this is the kind of product you want to procure.
Yeah, let me take Fabien's question on what are you saying about contracting and hedging and the regulation of that. I suppose what we're trying to address is the problem that the crisis threw up, which was that competitive retailers had sold electricity 1 year forward to their customers, but they were purchasing electricity in the monthly market, and so they hadn't matched their assets and liabilities. I think there is room for regulating that. Of course, saying that if you've got to be, I don't know, 99%, 95% matched, so that if you sell a bunch of one-year contracts, you've got to have bought power in the wholesale market for 1 year. And of course, that would have the impact of deepening the forward market. If it would have the impact that if you actually could persuade people to take a 3-year contract, you'd have to go into the market and have a 3-year contract against that. So that's the problem that, clearly wasn't being addressed in some countries. It led to major supplier failures in the Netherlands and in the UK, and was clearly something that individual customers couldn't be expected to know. If I'm a retail customer, I can't be expected to, self-regulate the contract position of my retailer. That was the job of the regulator, and that was a job they were clearly doing really badly, certainly in the UK and also in the Netherlands.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Claire and the team, for your interesting proposal that raised many questions on how we can progress and implement what you propose. So I guess we have to now turn to the last session of our conference. Fabien?
Yes, and as always, we always conclude CEEM Conference with partners, the sponsors. So we have representatives from EDF to start. Laurent, Fabien, I don't know who's going to speak. Then we have EPEX, Philippe. Then we have RTE, Vincent. And then Total Energy, Thomas. I suggest we start in this order, if that's okay, the order of the program.
Je comprends donc que j'entame. Je vais le faire en français. Je comprends que ce n'est pas un réel obstacle pour l'ensemble des participants, surtout si j'utilise bien le micro. Ce qui illustre la présente crise, c'est, me semble-t-il, l'imprévisibilité des recettes et des prix finaux. Alors, sur les recettes des producteurs, on l'a vu avec ce que j'ai presque envie d'appeler la première crise du système électrique européen, c'était il y a 10 ans, où l'on voit que l'interférence entre le modèle cible du marché et des décisions de politique publique, pourtant totalement partagées par tout le monde, je veux parler de l'encouragement des renouvelables, de l'efficacité énergétique, on voit ce que ça provoque. C'est complètement automatique d'un point de vue économique, bien sûr. Les coûts marginaux de court terme qui plongent, 50 gigawatts de cycles combinés à gaz ruinés, des soucis pour la sécurité d'alimentation. Beaucoup de travaux ont été faits à cette époque sans qu'il y ait de réelles modifications du modèle cible. Au contraire, il a plutôt été implémenté encore davantage via la directive de 2019. Aujourd'hui, c'est plutôt côté aval, où l'on s'aperçoit que les prix finaux peuvent subir des variations considérables, bien au-delà de l'idée qu'on avait d'inciter le consommateur à piloter sa demande et ce genre de choses. On est bien sur des problèmes structurels, des investissements d'électrification qui ne se font pas parce que ce qu'on économise, à savoir de l'énergie fossile, a la mauvaise propriété d'indexer totalement le prix de l'électricité que l'on va se mettre à consommer. Également même des problèmes de délocalisation qui font rudement écho, bien sûr, aux questions que commence à se poser l'Europe entière sur la désindustrialisation. Et cette remarque mérite certainement d'être embarquée dans une réforme du market design. Je veux parler du fait que tout le monde est d'accord, c'est une cible partagée, il n'y en a pas tant que ça au sein de l'Union européenne. Nous allons vers un système électrique où presque toute la valeur ajoutée de la chaîne sera homemade, à savoir décarboner le mix de production électrique, avec ou sans le nucléaire, ça dépend des États membres, mais en tout cas sans importer beaucoup de choses de l'extérieur de l'Europe. Dès lors, avec 2 tiers et davantage demain de cette chaîne de valeur faite en Europe, pourquoi se retrouver dans une situation où on est aussi exposé que quand on consomme du pétrole. On ne va pas créer de pétrole dans le sol de l'Union européenne, d'ailleurs on compte s'en passer, mais il est un peu étonnant que nous ne profitions pas, que nous ne nous mettions pas en mesure de profiter économiquement, stratégiquement aussi, de cette électricité que l'on veut produite en Europe. Alors, à partir de là, beaucoup de travaux qui ont été cités tout à l'heure ont convergé vers une notion de marché hybride. Il y a un point qui semble assez bien partagé à ce stade et auquel adhère EDF, c'est de dire que ce qu'il faut réformer et d'une façon énorme, pour reprendre le mot de Mme von der Leyen, ce n'est pas le marché de gros de court terme et la formation du coût marginal de court terme. Non, c'est la façon dont ensuite se forment les recettes des producteurs et les prix finaux à la consommation. Donc le marché de gros de court terme, bien sûr, il y a encore quelques perfectionnements possibles, il faut le préserver. D'abord parce qu'il permet le bon emploi des actifs existants, dont les interconnexions. Par conséquent, c'est aussi le facteur d'intégration européenne par le marché. Il ne s'agit pas de laisser tomber cela. C'est bien le volet formation des prix et des recettes sur lequel il faut travailler. Alors comment là, je ne suis pas venu vous dire, voilà le meilleur modèle possible parce que c'est celui que préfère EDF. Non. Mais à coup sûr, côté amont, il faut évidemment introduire des contrats de long terme. Des contrats de long terme qui permettent à la fois la visibilité pour les contreparties et puis qui permettent d'orienter, de compléter le résultat spontané du marché, puisque là aussi, c'est un objectif européen partagé. Il s'agit de tenir des trajectoires qui nous emmènent vers le bas carbone. Il y a des feuilles de route qui sont établies. Il faut même que chaque État membre établisse un plan à 10 ans. On peut faire un regard sur la cohérence de tout ça, procéder à des ajustements. Mais ensuite, il faut la tenir, cette feuille de route. Et de ce point de vue, la possibilité pour la puissance publique d'intervenir, de déclencher ce qui manque et de donner la visibilité voulue, paraît essentiel. Je parle de tous les actifs bas carbone, je parle des actifs existants comme des actifs neufs. Je parle des deux à la fois, parce que pérenniser un actif existant, c'est aussi une décision d'investissement, c'est aussi un élément de la chaîne qui conduit de la trajectoire, qui conduit vers le bas carbone. Et je n'y reviens pas, c'est ce qu'exposait Natalia Fabra tout à l'heure, le design de ces contrats long terme, ce n'est pas une chose évidente en soi, il faut à la fois qu'ils conduisent un actif sous contrat à bien optimiser selon le marché de gros, comme je l'ai suggéré tout à l'heure, et en même temps, c'est quelque chose qui doit être adapté aux caractéristiques de l'actif. On ne peut pas traiter un champ d'éolien en mer comme une centrale nucléaire, comme une station de transfert d'énergie par pompage, évidemment. Côté aval, là l'idée ça va être d'accrocher les prix finaux au coût du système électrique. Je dis bien au coût du système électrique. C'est bien cet accrochage cost-base qui doit pouvoir également être pratiqué s'agissant de former les prix finaux et pas seulement un accrochage market-based. Vous allez me dire c'est équivalent en théorie. Les coûts marginaux de long terme sont égaux aux coûts marginaux de court terme à l'optimum, on le sait tous. Sauf que la façon d'y arriver, on l'a quand même vu, est fort compliquée, fort semée d'embûches, d'incertitudes. Dès lors, c'est plutôt la deuxième voie qu'il paraît plus sage de retenir, c'est-à-dire l'accrochage au coût. Ce qui n'exclut pas, évidemment, tous les éléments d'incitation par rapport à la situation en temps réel. Ça a été évoqué également dans cette conférence, de tarifs time of use et ce genre de choses. Alors, c'est certainement sur ce lien entre l'amont et l'aval qu'il peut y avoir le plus de discussions. On pourrait le dire en projetant une image un peu extrême, cette idée d'un agrégateur unique, c'est une solution, je ne sais pas quelle est la meilleure, hein, je l'ai dit, je le rappelle, ou bien au moins imaginer d'industrialiser, de bien organiser les énormes transferts financiers qui de fait sont intervenus tout récemment entre l'amont et l'aval. Ils sont dans un sens qui est manifeste, vu le niveau des prix de marché de gros. N'oublions pas qu'ils peuvent se faire dans l'autre sens. Des excursions à 20 € par mégawattheure, il n'est pas du tout exclu qu'on en connaisse à nouveau. Il faut avoir en tête un système dans lequel les coûts de court terme seront formés par plein de machins à coût variable nul, un risque de défaillance, et puis entre les deux, des stockages. Hein, ça surprend certains, mais lorsque les renouvelables à coût variable nul couvrent plus que la demande Et dès qu'on commence à prendre 1 kWh de cette production pour alimenter un stockage, eh ben, le coût marginal du système n'est plus 0. Ça surprend un peu, mais c'est comme ça. Donc, il faut quand même y penser en concevant ces systèmes qui vont former des transferts, finalement, entre l'amont et l'aval. Ça doit aussi permettre une concurrence, cette fois sur le segment retail, qu'il faut vraiment centrer sur la qualité de l'exercice de ce métier de commercialisation, des formules tarifaires intelligentes, de l'innovation, la relation avec le client. C'est ça qui peut rendre utile, précieuse, une concurrence sur ce marché retail. Pas la possibilité d'aller spéculer sur l'approvisionnement et de se dire que si on a fait une bêtise, il sera toujours temps d'aller pleurer auprès de la tutelle. C'est pas ça la concurrence retail. Donc au total, il faut sans doute aller vers un nouveau mix de règles et de partage de cette régulation entre l'Union et les États membres, je pense. Au niveau de l'Union, le marché de gros, la coordination des développements en production et en réseau aussi, je l'ai évoqué tout à l'heure. Au niveau des États membres, peut-être d'une façon qui remet à l'ordre du jour une certaine notion de subsidiarité, la façon dont on forme les règles présidant au contrat de long terme amont, la façon dont on organise, c'est ce qui revient in fine à des transferts entre l'amont et l'aval, c'est-à-dire la fonction de lissage des coûts qui apparaissent sur le marché de gros de court terme et la fonction d'accrochage des prix finaux à la structure du mix de production. Et ça, a priori, ça peut être subsidiaire, comme c'est fait dans tous les États fédéraux qui ont réussi pourtant à mettre en commun leur diplomatie et leur armée. Ils ont laissé à leurs États fédérés le soin de réguler l'électricité dans pas mal d'aspects. Donc, a priori, il y a bien une question de ce type qui doit sans doute faire partie des réflexions que l'on a sur l'énorme réforme structurelle dont parle la présidente de la Commission. Je vous remercie.
Je propose qu'on continue dans l'ordre qui était convenu. Donc Philippe, tu as la parole.
Thank you, Fabien, and well, good evening, everyone. I'm going to switch back to English. First few points I'd like to make. First of all, I'm very happy about the introduction made by Acer and Creux, because I think this is very important that we remind these things. Sometimes we feel that even at the highest level, we lose sense of what's working and what's not. So I think this was very welcome, and we should do that a lot more and at every level, because the idea that the market is broken or it's not working is just unacceptable. I have to say, on the other hand, I'm very unhappy about the point that was made earlier about the fact that prices should be at 200 instead of 400, which was totally unfounded and is not based on any thorough analysis. I mean, we have regulators in the room, let them say if there is market power and manipulation, but I think this type of unfounded comments are totally detrimental to everything we have been doing for 2 decades. Now, let me talk about the current situation. I think it's very important that and I think it was agreed among everyone today, that we should not focus on the short term, but focus the structural reforms on the long term. Why? Because the long term is about investments, and it's really the only way that we can get out of this situation. So intervention can help alleviate the bill for some categories, and we certainly think that it should be done for the most vulnerable consumers. But it's very important to protect the price signal, because the price signal, if muted, will not help us to get out of this situation. Quite on the contrary, it will make sure we still stick to this high gas price for many, many more years to come. So intervention on the long term is really the key, and not on the short term. And this intervention on the long term has to recognize already that there is a derivative market that is working. It might be improved. It might be made given longer time horizon. More hedging products have to be also added. This is something that that is part of what could be considered for the future. But I would like to be a bit provocative here and say,
we mainly, the countries that mainly focus on the derivative market not working are certainly those that have taken the least measures to make it work in the past. So I'm thinking, for example, in France, where we've very often hear about the market being broken and prices not reflect, the long-term prices not reflecting the fundamentals. I think it's also important that we recognize that we've been through 2 decades of intervention with Tartam, AREN, and many other exotic mechanisms that have not helped the market to really develop in terms of liquidity in derivatives. And we now see how important liquidity is in these times. This is where it is really important to have a well-functioning and liquid market and not the opposite. But again, I'd like to focus on the long term and what needs to be done, what can be improved. And a first recommendation or a disclaimer, which would be to say, let's not centralize too much. We have based our design in Europe and now for 2 decades on decentralized self-scheduling markets that have been working very well. And they protect us by bringing resilience to the system and by creating the efficiency that we need to have a good dispatch and to have good cross-border flows. So it is very important to refrain in this situation from centralizing too much. Actually, I would like to point out that the countries where intervention has been the highest and the quickest are the most centralized ones. And I'm thinking, for example, of the Greek market or the Spanish market, which are a lot more government owned or government intervened than other markets, as for example, CWE. So refrain from centralizing too much, but then what's left if we don't centralize, which would be the easy take on that, on these difficult situations that we're going through? Well, we can do a lot of the things that were discussed today. For example, improve the hedging products, make sure the risk is shared better between the different market parties. We can think of harmonizing the tools that are today totally unharmonized. For example, the capacity markets, which are really the locomotive of investment in many of the EU markets. And we end up today with a patchwork of about 20, 25 different types of mechanisms that are finding it very difficult to talk to each other and have a set of common rules. So harmonization is very much key, especially on this long-term time frame and on these capacity remuneration mechanisms. The other thing, and this is going to be my last point, is that we have to think of this new world out of the subsidies regime. We don't need the subsidies anymore. Subsidies have led to the situation in which we are today with more and more renewable bases, but we don't need them anymore. And actually the system cannot work if we keep subsidizing, because then we do end up in a situation that was mentioned previously where price could equal to zero, to marginal cost of renewables. If there aren't any subsidies, this is not going to happen because the renewables will also need the market for their fixed cost recovery. Now, what we could do is move away from the national subsidy schemes to more European-wide tools, for example, the guarantees of origin, which are a very important tool to develop these renewables and move slowly away from these national mechanisms that have found today their limitation. Yeah, with that, I'm finished and would be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Philippe. So we continue with Vincent.
Thank you, Fabien, and thank you for the chair for organizing the conference, which was very interesting this afternoon. Well, I will not announce you the creation of a new subsidiary by RTE for planning the world power system and for auctioning all this. Well, possibly later on for another conference. More seriously, well, I will take some food for thought because I was mentioning it. I think good ideas were presenting this afternoon. First of all, it was recalled by a different person. I understood that it was mentioned at the beginning of the conference. Unfortunately, I missed a bit. It was recalling what was working on well, and let's say the sport market at works well, even in these different difficult times we have all experienced. Well, we think it's something which is very important for the whole system operation to have indeed this key part of the power system still functioning, and I think it's something which is shared, and we really think that's something which is important to keep in the whole system. Something which is also important, and that was recalled by Philippe just a moment ago, well, the capacity mechanism, when it was implemented, in particular, for instance, in France, it has showed that it works well too. You managed to keep some capacity online, whereas they would have been endangered in a market situation. And this is something also which is important to keep in the framework while discussing the whole reform we're talking all along. As Philippe also mentioned, there is still some refinement to do on the system, some barriers to remove. And for the long term, I also agree a lot with Philippe. Possibly it's because we are more or less in the same age, and we have done more or less the same kind of work all along our career. Well, the matter is two parts. It's on the one hand the long run, and also the question of affordability of the retail market. And that's, we think it's two areas where it's needed to have progress in the current market design. And why is it needed? Is it needed because we have experience in France, and we expect to have the same thing in Europe in the coming years, to have a disalignment between the cost structure of the power system and the prices. This is because of we want to have a decarbonization, and a decarbonization path faster than what the fundamentals gives us. We can try to trace the CO2 market, etc., but we still are in situations where we are leaving some learning curves and things like that, which still means that we will have this disalignment. And even in a power system where we will have decarbonized gas, the situation we're experiencing with very high gas prices, we will have it because decarbonized gas is also expensive. It's not cheap, and we will see this kind of situation also happening. And what Laurent was mentioning about what we will see on the price will also happen because of all the storage and the demand flexibility we will have. So this tale of price converging toward long-term marginal cost, well, I've been taught with that for several years. I'm still waiting for it. Possibly it will happen when I will be retired, but it's not for soon. So, saying all this, since this misalignment may last for long, we need two kinds of mechanisms. We need mechanisms to secure investment, and we need mechanisms to realign prices and costs for consumables. But in order to do so, well, I am not quite convinced about the tools to implement. I think we have different tools, and that the good solution is still to find, and possibly it's not the same depending on the framework you're in. And even I think, as French citizen, it's not a good idea to close the debate too soon, because when we will have to discuss at the European level, we will only be seen as the French guy wanting something centralized, and the debate will be closed. So, and we will lose the debate. So, that's quite classical, let's say. So we have different solutions. I think we have also we should not prevent ourselves from looking at very different solutions from a very regulated one. For instance, I'm thinking about the UK with some regulated asset base for some assets. But also looking at PPAs and situations in which PPAs could also be the good solutions because let's say the appetite of the different countries for centralization is different. So that's something to have in mind. And for retail market, I think that's the same thing that we should also let's rethink all the fundamentals and also wondering whether we should have retail market for the mass market or for all the mass market or leave it open. Well, we have work like that in France with not a fully open market in electricity. Well, it was not a nightmare, and even right now we are quite happy of not having a too widely open market. But nevertheless, we should question that. And the other way around, we should also, if we want to live with a fully open retail market, then why not impose some obligation on retailers? In the bank sector, there is prudency rules forcing the retailers to hedge in order to be able to be resilient to shocks. Why not? Why the European level couldn't impose this kind of thing? Well, it was imposed in the bank sector because of a crisis, if I remember well. That's the kind of thing that also could be managed. Or also other solutions that a lot of us know in the French framework with some parafiscal measures. But I think that should be a question whether it should be fully encapsulated into the power bill or whether it's managed outside in the whole decarbonization sector. And that will be the very end of my intervention, is that even if we have a wide spectrum of intervention that could be implemented on all these kind of different toolboxes, I think what is at stake is indeed decarbonization and even industrialization or reindustrialization of Europe. And I think from this point of view, it should be taken into account what's going on at the border of Europe, taking into account the pricing of carbon. Because if we do not succeed in aligning the conditions for our industry with regard what's going on worldwide, also taking into account what's the impact on the climate side, what we could expect and what we are, well, I was a bit surprised about the impact of what was mentioning in macroeconomic terms. But what we could have is to see some industries going out of Europe because energy is too expensive in Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vincent. So I think, Thomas, you're last.
So I guess I'm the last thing between you and the cocktail. So I try to be prompt. First of all, thank you very much, Fabien, and the organizers for inviting me here. It's always a pleasure. One of the joys of getting old is that you see people and friends and you see them again, and it's always great to see you all. So thank you. Having said that, I somehow provocatively, I don't think we are looking at the right problem. I think the problem in Europe we are facing is not so much the design of power markets, It's just the fact that we are running out of primary energy. Today, Europe, EU 27 imports about 80% of its primary energy. 80%, 80. So, you know, it made sense at some point to go after Russian energy because it's, you know, very close by. It's a complementary asset to our demand. But now that we are out of Russian oil, gas, and coal, we are really in trouble. And to Vincent's point, the real challenge we are facing is how do we keep our economies thriving? How do we keep our industries in Europe without cheap, abundant primary energy? And that, I think, is the problem we ought to be solving. In the long term, and I think Laurent mentioned that, the expectation is that we'll have homemade energy, which will be wind, renewables, nuclear, and that somehow we'll have more access to our primary energy. Of course, what we tend to forget when we talk about renewables is that a renewable power system relies on a lot of components that are not necessarily native to Europe. I'm talking about critical materials, critical minerals that we don't necessarily find in Europe. So I think the first order of business would be to think strategically about how do we source the materials we will need to build our energy post fossil fuel system. And that's hard because something that happened over the last 12 months is that we've moved from a word that we economists like very much, which is the world of Ricardo, the world of commerce. We've moved into a world where geostrategic concerns, states, politics, policies take precedence over economics. So we cannot just rely on trade to get us what we want. We have to think about the way the states are going to decide and are going to behave. So I think that that's the real problem, much more than the market design and the twitches we can make to the market design. So that's what I wanted to say first. Second, because it's about market design, I'm concerned. As I age, I get to be concerned a lot. I think in the back you're young, so you're not concerned, but when you get to be older, you'll be concerned. I'm concerned that we might inadvertently throw the baby with the bathwater. If you're a politician and you hear a discussion about market design, you think that we'll come back with a new market design and that somehow we'll throw away the spot price, the spot market. That, I think, could be the casualty of this entire discussion, that somehow we'll have to get rid of, modify the spot market. And that would be a tragedy, because the European wholesale power market is a great success. We lost 100 terawatt hours of French nuclear capacity this year. We lost 40 terawatt hours of wind turbines last year, and yet the lights are remained on. So this is a big success, and I'm concerned that this entire discussion about new market design, new market architecture, even though we all start our presentation by saying we should keep the spot market alive, I'm concerned that when we get outside of this room, when we get into the political arena, people will take, okay, let's just throw away the spot market. And that would be a tragedy. Now, the last point is what do we do about investment, long-term, missing markets? And here, the answer is, to me at least, I'm a simple guy, reasonably simple. There is no long-term contracts in Europe because European regulation prevents it. I have the chance to work very closely with Fabien, and I remember the time where he was working on the CFD for Hinkley Point, you know, the nuclear power plant in the UK, and he had to make a super convoluted argument that was just, and we were teaching together. And I remember him working day and night to make the argument that long-term contracts were possible and were helpful. So the first thing to do is for the European Commission to stop opposing long-term contracts, and then let every country design a long-term contracting architecture. And as a final thought, I did a bit of numbers because, you know, at TotalEnergies we do a lot of numbers. We are a numbers-based company. So countries will have very different answers to the long-term contracting problem. So we looked at the share of fixed, constant variable cost generation, nuclear renewables, versus the share of small customers. Because you think that somehow state-provided long-term contract, all the insurance we talk about should look at small customers. Those would be the target. And the thing that you can contract on the supply side would be constant price, constant variable cost generation. So look at the ratio, sort of coverage ratio. So the good news is that it's about 122% on the EU 29 as a whole. So we have much more, by and large, it's low carbon generation, it's nuclear renewables. We have much more than we have retail customers. So somehow we think we can provide some price protection. So that's good for Europe. In France, thanks to our friends at EDF, the coverage ratio is 165. So we have much, much, much more low carbon fixed cost generation than our retail load. So it's very easy. We ask EDF to sell power at a fixed price and we're home free. In Great Britain, life is more complicated because the ratio is only 88%. So what we mean is if they contract out, if you guys contract out all of your low carbon, renewable and nuclear generation, you cannot cover all of your retail customers. So you'll have to make tough choices. And Italy, is there anybody from Italy here? No, it's even worse. It's only 70%. So the problem might be solved when we get to 2030, because by that time the ratio will be 160 everywhere. But until then, it's going to be very complicated. So I think it's great to see everyone here. It's a pleasure to be here. Great to hear great ideas and great work. But please, let's not forget the long term and what we need to do about our primary energy supply. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for these thought-provoking ideas. I want to give a chance before we close to any reaction or question. Fabienne.
Sorry. Yeah, remember 20 years ago, a previous president of... Mais tu as vu, le Covid est quand même... je vais le dire en français. Il y a 20 ans, il y a un petit peu plus de 20 ans, il y avait un président de la République française, rappelez-vous, au sommet de la Terre, qui avait dit « La maison brûle et nous regardons ailleurs ». Je pense qu'on n'en est pas loin pour ce qui concerne les problématiques énergétiques, et en particulier électriques en Europe. Je crois que le voyage du président de la République actuelle pour aller voir son homologue américain, notamment pour parler de ce qui se passe en termes de plan RIRA, c'est... Ok. Je pense qu'on commence à avoir une prise de conscience, me semble-t-il, qu'effectivement la maison est en train de brûler en Europe. Mais en revanche, j'ai quand même l'impression que malgré toutes les discussions qui sont ici, et je remercie ma chère, parce que non, c'est pas moi, c'était une prise électrique qui ne fonctionnait mal ou qui faisait de l'arsène. Et je crois que les discussions qu'on a ici depuis plus de 10 ans ont fait progresser la compréhension qu'on pouvait avoir de questions, mais je me demande si aujourd'hui il ne faut pas plus accélérer encore, et je n'ai pas le mode d'emploi. Autrement dit, on voit bien que ces discussions, elles sont intéressantes, elles font progresser la compréhension qu'on peut avoir des solutions qu'on peut trouver, mais la maison est vraiment en train de brûler. Voilà, je ne suis pas très optimiste et je voulais vous en faire part.
Yeah, Antonio, and yeah, maybe Philippe, we take the last two reactions.
Yeah, so thank you a lot for this very, very interesting meeting. So for me, it's funny because some of the solutions is something like coming back to the past, so something that we have already lived in the past. So for me, there is something that we have not spoken about that I would like to listen a bit what you think about. That is this inframarginal cap that we are putting in place now that change all the rules that we have already. So for me, we are saying we need to change rules because it's not running, but what is not running is the changing of rules. So because we are continuously changing things. And for me, the question is quite important because when you see that we decide to put that new rule of inframarginal cap, we can understand that in regulated asset that has been supported by any mechanism. For me, it's quite difficult to understand that pure merchant asset will be impacted for that. Because we can change all the rules that we want to design a new market, but the investor will invest in the future? Because for me, that is the key issue. So we change again, but do you think really that someone will invest in pure merchant access in the future if we are changing continuously rules, and even those assets will have an impact again? So it's something that for me, I think is a point that is important. Anyways, thank you a lot for your speech.
Just a little bit to reply to Philippe that was commenting on my comment. What I said about the wholesale market prices was a reference to a quote by RTE that was made on October 18. So I read it in French. So, les prix de l'électricité sur les marchés à terme pour la fin de 2022 et le début de 2023 intègrent toujours une prime de risque qui apparaît manifestement disproportionnée par rapport aux fondamentaux de l'équilibre offre-demande. I understand that markets are always right, as you say, but for me, my experience is that when I made the calculation was a reference with the price of CCGT and the cost of CCGT and the cost of coal power plant.
Moi, non, j'ai le droit de parler pour conclure 2 minutes. Je pense que ce qui a peut-être manqué à ce débat, c'est le constat sur la crise actuelle. On voit que les Allemands parlent de Zeitenwende, ce qui veut dire changement d'époque en fait. Donc est-ce que cette crise c'est juste un petit remous ou est-ce que c'est quelque chose qui est induit par notre organisation de secteur électrique? Et moi c'est ce que je pense. La crise qu'on vit aujourd'hui, c'est pas la crise pétrolière de 73, c'est une crise gazière qui ne touche que l'Europe. La crise pétrolière touchait le monde entier. Et là, il n'y a que l'Europe qui s'est fourvoyée et qui est un peu dans le pétrin. Alors ça touche aussi les autres pays parce qu'il y a des répercussions au niveau des autres énergies. Mais c'est quand même quelque chose qui touche que l'Europe. Le marché a été fait pour le gaz. Souvenons-nous, il a été fait par les Anglais parce qu'ils avaient découvert du gaz en mer du Nord. Les Allemands l'ont retenu parce qu'ils en avaient besoin comme complément des énergies renouvelables. Ils voulaient s'approvisionner en Russie. Donc c'est une crise qui a été induite par le gaz et qui touche le gaz. Après, on a les implications géopolitiques. Et je pense que ce constat n'est pas fait. Et je pense qu'avant de parler de technique de market design, il faut faire ce constat et savoir, le marché c'est un instrument, la planification c'est un instrument, et c'est de savoir qu'est-ce qu'on veut par la suite et l'instrument qu'on utilisera pour y arriver.
Thank you, Etienne. Thank you all. I think that's a good topic to close. I'd like, before we close, to give the floor to Jan and to thank all of the speakers for their interventions. Jan, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Fabien. C'est le cadeau empoisonné là de faire la conclusion. I'll switch in English. It's very tough to make a conclusion of this wide-ranging and occasionally controversial debate. I would sort of offer, in conclusion, a little bit of a consensus under the heading sort of beyond ideology. I think we're all d'accord, even with different nuances, that markets need to evolve. They need to become not radically changed, European electricity markets, but they need to evolve. And I would say not because of the war, and not because of high gas prices, which they mastered fairly well, but because of the need, as Laurent said, of reaching net zero and the enormous investment needs that we have in that sense. And in this tension between market and regulation, that's why I sort of put this up, which might be again debated at another time. It's not about the particulars, but the idea is as much market as possible, as much centralized regulation as necessary. We need to centralize smartly and selectively, not for ideological reasons, not for principal reasons, but for reasons where we identify a market failure, and where these market failures, and currently we do have a market failure, insufficient amount of low carbon investment, and here are different ideas which all of you know, and that was mentioned. We do have all these instruments already in the market today, but we need to do it coherently, we need it to go consistently, we need to know why we do it. I think sometimes we don't really know why we do it, but it's just sort of things that are being bandied around. So there needs to be a conversation slightly more based on basic economic concepts. Where are the market failures? How do we correct it? We don't want to support a combined cycle gas turbine in the same way that we want to support a wind farm, or in the same way that we want to support a nuclear plant or a hydroelectric power plant. Then again, so these are 2 points. The third point would be there is a big question about the retail market, and perhaps we didn't talk about it enough, but I think there's also a lot of consensus there between Claire, Tim, Dominique. Unfortunately, it went a little bit awry, but ultimately the concern is the same: to provide low carbon energy at competitive cost and high levels of security supply in an affordable manner. And I think even Tim's very market-centered approach is ultimately not that far from some idea of some social tariff or whatever, just that it's provided by the market, and where you could sort of then intervene by fairly easily in the structuring of these long-term forward obligations by some sort of public entity. And that brings me to the last point that was mentioned before by Dominique and by Christophe. Do not ask too much. We shouldn't ask too much from market design. Also Thomas Olivier. Market design can reduce the economic costs of some risks, can reallocate them, but it cannot make costs disappear. And we have enormous tasks ahead, and net zero will be an enormous task and will cost more in whatever market design. We had an external shock with, of course, the war and the geopolitical tensions that go away, that exist. These are real costs. These are real wealth transfers, and the best market design in the world cannot make them away. Cannot make them go away. And there I would like to end with an open question that I've been asking myself today and also already in the past. Ultimately, those added costs that we have, external shocks, low carbon objectives, we want them that they're being paid by ratepayers. I have the feeling that we have to pose ourselves the question whether slowly, somehow, we're not better off if we really sort of take them out, the financing out of the electricity market, and allocate them more to taxpayers. I have the feeling that the political economy has an equilibrium which sort of sees a slightly different allocation of costs between taxpayers and ratepayers. This is just an end of a thought, end of the conference. It's too much to come up with anything more how shall I say, grandly sounding, but I think the solution will be in the concrete and smartly, selectively finding equilibrium between markets and regulation. Thank you.
I think we have a cocktail outside, and thank you again.